All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of the Sarantine Mosaic by Gavriel K. And we have some different editions here. Josh and I have the same ones. So, hooray. All these different editions. We are going to begin spoiler-free before getting into spoilers. And before I even do that, I'm going to go ahead and just introduce my guests. Same panel as for Tigana. So if you missed that discussion, you should check it out because we did do a wonderful discussion on that book. And we did begin for the first, I would say 20 to 30 minutes spoiler-free on that one. So I am hoping that we can begin spoiler-free, talk about our impressions of the book, talk about some of the themes in a non-spoiler way, and whether you should read this duology by Gavriel K. And before I do, I just want to go ahead again and introduce my guests. So I'll start over to my right this time with Jake Bishop.
Same way. Hi everyone. I'm Jake. I read books sometimes. I've read a couple Guy Gavriel K books, and I might be slightly enthusiastic. I have been, I think, accused of being on his payroll multiple times, somewhat ironically, but I think it's kind of like, ironically, but like, you wouldn't be surprised if it was true. And very excited to talk about Sarantine Mosaic since these are my favorite works by Mr. K.
Those are your favorite works by K? Oh, I didn't realize that.
Lord of Emperors is my favorite. And as a whole, the Sarantine is my favorite.
Okay, good to know. All right. And then, and by the way, Jake Bishop has been a huge influence on many of us.
Except Bridger. I didn't influence.
But you influenced a lot of us to find Bridger. So that was a wonderful discovery, too.
I can claim no credit for Bridger, but the other two, partially.
All right. And then next we have Josh from Red Prairie Books, who I co-own the Fireside Discord with, and who has also become a Guy Gavriel K enthusiast. So hello, Josh.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, huge fan. This is my 7th book by K. I'll be starting my 8th one next week. I'm hoping to get through actually all of the standalones before his new book comes out in May. Except for Isabel, I'm kind of saving that for last because of the lower reception for it. But generally speaking, this is just such an extraordinary author that I'm just so enamored with virtually everything he does. So I can't wait to talk about it with the panel that talked about Tigana, because I think this book series is significantly a cut above that book. And Tigana's great. So this is going to be great.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And then we also have Bridger from the Library Ladder, who's also been a huge Guy Gavriel K enthusiast, who has, I think, influenced a large part of our community and beyond to pick up this wonderful author. So welcome back, Bridger.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna. I take no credit at all for Jake's enthusiasm. So I completely reciprocate his thoughts there. It's been 2.5 years, or actually maybe even a little more than that, since I made my first GGK video in which I unabashedly declared him the greatest living fantasy author. And in 2.5 years, my opinion has not changed. I still hold to that opinion. And I'm very, very happy to be here with the three of you to talk about one of my absolute favorite works by him.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Well, we're so happy you're here with us. And I'm so excited to be chatting with you guys about this duology. And thank you to everyone in the chat. I'm just scrolling through, but I am reading all of your hellos. And I'm so glad that you're here with us. We do have a question really quickly for Jake.
So I don't know exactly where to find them. They're published by Viking. Actually, a friend of mine that I know from the University Book Club found them in a Value Village. And I was just like, may I purchase them from you? So I don't actually know where to find them originally. I just know they were published by Viking and that they're hardcovers.
Did you really say mayhaps? I love that.
I did. I'd like to thanks George R. Martin for being an influence. But I can confirm I've heard it from the man himself that these are some of his favorite covers, because he talked in Vancouver and I went and I got these signed. And he was like, and he put them together, and because there was the other author there, Jamie Miro. He wrote, I forget the name of his book. Anyway, and he held them up and he was like, sometimes you get lucky. So I can confirm that these covers are Guy Gavriel K approved. So
they're beautiful. They're beautiful. I love the colors. And hello, Matt. Matt's in the chat. Matt is also a co-owner of the Fireside Discord alongside Josh and me. So we have the Fireside family around. And yes, I think it's going to be a fantastic discussion here today. So we're going to go ahead and start. And I apologize if I get a little behind on the chat here, but we're just going to go ahead and get into non-spoilers to start out with. So impressions of this book. I think some of you already gave some of your general impressions, but are there any other general impressions you want to say? Jake, we'll start with you since you already kind of gave away that this is your favorite.
This is my favorite work by Kay. I think it's the almost like it's called the Sarantine Mosaic, and it has like the almost slightly more mosaic structure where it hops around a lot more. It works so unbelievably well. I think Kay is at his absolute best writing like a lot of side characters. I actually think his side character writing is just extraordinary because of how efficient he is. And I think I always think of it as at the same time, like it covers both really like what would be considered important historical events, but also like super zoomed in the day-to-day life of people. And it makes both of them like exactly equally interesting. Like I care just as much when like a young cook gets praised from like his culinary hero as I do when some like grand event happens involving an emperor. And I think it's just truly unbelievable that way. It's definitely the K work that I've thought about as well the most after. And I think on reread, I've even just only grown to appear it more. I think most K novels have this the most, but it's the one that I think to the highest degree has the aspect of great novels, which is like the more you zoom in, it just stays the same resolution. Like the more you pay attention to details, you find like just as much detail as you look at like the smaller and smaller things, which is always hard to describe, but I think you can feel when you read. And then Lord of Emperors, I think, is just ridiculous. Like the amount of sometimes I'll just open to a random page of Lord of Emperors and I'll be like, I forgot that scene would happen. But oh my, that was incredible. Just yeah, Lord of Emperors might be my favorite novel. It's in like it's either a Robin Hobb novel or Lord of Emperors, and depends on which day you ask me.
Really? Wow, that is extremely high praise, especially coming from you. So, wow. Okay, and obviously, you and Josh share very similar tastes because I know how much Josh loves Robin Hobb as well. So, Josh,
yeah, I think Jake's like my literary spirit animal because it seems like all the things that he loves have turned out to be the things that I love most too. So, yeah, because Hobb and Kay are my number 1 and number 2, or 1 and 1A as far as fantasy genre is concerned. But yeah, the one thing that Jake talked about is the thing that I find extraordinary. How on paper I don't feel like this should have worked. Like talking about the same assistant cook. I'm gonna
I love that guy.
Gyros or whatever his name was. I'm gonna love that guy forever. And he's in like 4 scenes, and he's not important for the overall plot. But Kay somehow makes it work with all of these players that aren't really a part of the greater story going on. And I just found it just fascinating, not only how, I mean, obviously I talked about that in my video last week about how the story itself is a mosaic, but also how the plot itself kind of revealed itself that way. And you're just along for the ride. And then about 40-50% into Lord of Emperors, oh my goodness, like the last half of that book was just remarkable in just how much happened and how well executed it was. And then at the end, how much I didn't realize until I got to the end, like how many of these characters I really had such that I really cared for them. And I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I got to that epilogue. It just it's just a remarkable work. And I know Kyle's in the chat. He says it's the best one and it should be my favorite. I'm not letting recency bias affect my ranking yet, but it's right up there with Song for Our Bond for me.
Let correct bias.
Interesting. All right. And we also have a question from Heidi here, and who asks, I think he is the greatest living author, not just of the fantasy genre, who is better in the regular lit world. I don't have an answer to that, but Richard, maybe you have some thoughts in addition to your general thoughts about this duology?
Oh, I haven't actually given it that much thought in terms of comparing across all of the genres. He would definitely rank high on my just list of all authors. I wasn't trying to just pigeonhole him, because so much of his writing, while it is fantasy, it really transcends the genre in many, many ways, in part because the fantastical elements tend to be relatively minor. They aren't always, in fact, or rarely central to the story. They're more grace notes to the story, or in this one, and the Sarantine Mosaic, I'd say they play a little more active role than in some of his other books, but even still, it's not front and center at all. And a lot of people describe it as, well, he's just a historical fiction writer all dressed up. It's like, no, he's not. I mean, he does find inspiration in history, but when I hear people say that, and I've certainly gotten a lot of comments on my GGK videos, basically lambasting him because, he doesn't actually write fantasy. He's just writing, historical fiction. He's just taking real events and changing the names, and that's all he's doing. For me, that's an incredibly either very lazy take on his writing or a very, very uninformed one when it comes to knowledge of history. And these two books are a perfect example of that, because yes, Sarantium is based on Byzantium, back in the like 6th century or so, and the emperor and empress here in the Sarantine Mosaic really they have analogs back in Emperor Justinian and his empress Theodora. Justinian was trying to modernize the government and the laws at the time, which were incredibly corrupt. He was trying to expand his empire, particularly going westward. And he was trying to build an incredible cathedral, or just this beautiful, the Hagia Sophia that we have today in Istanbul. That's what he was building at the time. And absolutely, that translates directly to sailing to Sarantium. However, that's at the 30,000 foot level. If you zoom down, go down to what's actually happening. If you look at the character arcs of the emperor and empress in the Sarantine Mosaic, they do not track what actually happened in history. They do not. There are, again, some similarities. The empress in both real world and in Kay's world, yes, she was a dancer, actress, maybe prostitute, something before becoming empress. And she was considered very, very clever and very political. But what she actually does isn't the same. The actions they take, the events that transpire in these books, for the most part, did not happen in real life, in history. And so he's creating an entire story based on a very, very small number of data points, of historical data points, and making it his own. It's his own story. And so I love that about him. And because he's such a great writer, and he writes just beautiful prose. His character descriptions are incredibly evocative. When he describes events, and I know Jake's gonna gush about the chariot races. They are so well described. It's amazing how he's able to get the really subtle, affect, the emotion of the characters, and make it feel very real and really humanize the characters, like the assistant cook, who's an incredibly minor, completely superfluous character. But that character adds emotional depth to the story because of the skill that Kay has in his writing. And I love that about his writing. And so I wouldn't pigeonhole him as a fantasy writer. I'd say he's a fantastic author who just happens to write primarily in a fantastical genre, although he doesn't describe his own work as fantasy. It's, history with a quarter turn to the fantastic, or I think I've got that right. Jake, correct me if I'm wrong.
In this essay, I will argue that if you say K isn't fantasy, a massive bison will show up at your door and steal your soul.
Right. I have consistently maintained it is fantasy.
Oh yeah, I mean, 100% is.
K doesn't describe it as fantasy because
I think he doesn't describe it as like historical fantasy, because he's like, well, it's actually like historical fantasy is usually like in the historical setting, but adding fantastical characteristics. But he has some great quotes about like why he uses the fantastical in fantasy, because it's kind of smart.
Yeah. So as a general statement, though, I would say that this might be the most accessible of Kay's works for modern fantasy readers. For people who really like, multiple POVs, who really enjoy the political intrigue in a lot of modern fantasy, where you have it has, like I said, a little more of the fantastical elements in it compared to some of his other works. So it might not generate the knee-jerk reaction of the truly self-described fantasy purists that because there are no dragons, because there are no magic spells, it can't be fantasy. I'm exaggerating here, but these two books, I think, would be among the most accessible to modern fantasy readers, if not the most. And I think, Josh, you may have said something along those lines in your review video a few days ago. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mentioned that it actually started with a discussion on the Discord when someone said they were a fan of epic fantasy, so they didn't think they'd like this. And I said that it felt like epic fantasy because you had so many different characters, so many point of view characters. And our central protagonist in the second book, there's portions where we don't see him for 50 or 60 pages, and you don't even notice because you're so enwrapped with all of these other point of views. So I would definitely agree with that. It's not the kind of epic fantasy that maybe you're expecting if you want dragons and big battles and things like that, but you're certainly getting a lot of the traits that we would associate with epic fantasy today.
I'm biased just because it's my favorite. I think one difference it might have, but I don't think people should worry that much about it, because like I think a lot of the time I was probably like this like 5 years ago. I was like, oh yeah, I really like fantasy, and then you read something that's like it's kind of fantasy, and it's like, okay, it's really good. Who cares? I do think one aspect is there's something like Our Bone has a more like clear antagonist and protagonist, and like having the more clear like these are the antagonists might be slightly more familiar to epic fantasy fans than like Sarantine, because who's really like the antagonist of Sarantine? Who cares? But also you shouldn't worry about that. Just read whichever one sounds more interesting to you. You'll be fine. They're all good.
Yeah, I would say that this does not. I think the thing with Kay's fantasy is, I would say it's definitely fantasy, and to me, it has epic elements to it. I think all the books I've read so far, to me, have epic elements to it. But I think that it doesn't, at the same time, feel like very, very conventional genre fiction, in the sense like the way that he structures his books, that's the number one thing that comes to mind. I feel like he doesn't have the typical rise and fall of action. He does have climactic moments, but he still does some different things with structure, I think, than the typical genre fiction type of fantasy story. He definitely does different things with magic. He's definitely more subtle with that. And he writes with such beautiful prose and such intentionality to his themes. And so I feel like, and I feel like I've said this a million times, but I feel like tropes in K books don't feel like tropes. When you have a found family element, it doesn't feel like the ordinary found family. It doesn't feel as though the magic is the ordinary. There's something that obviously it's influenced by history, but there's something about it to me that feels like it transcends the genre at the same time as being the genre. That's my take on him.
I think it's because Josh said something interesting about the tropes in his videos, and it's gonna be interesting when he reads Fiona Bar. It's just like fantasy tropes. We got those. Yeah, you know, it's always good to aspire to character growth, Evie. So that's good.
Yeah.
And Evie's comment is a good one to key off of at the moment if we want to talk about getting into reading these books, because I think the first half or so of Sailing to Sarantium is a little bit sluggish. I can understand why someone might DNF it, you know, and Evie. Now, granted, Evie has very particular tastes, so maybe that has something to do with it too. But the journey to Sarantium takes quite a bit of time in the first book, and some of what happens on that journey, it's not entirely clear what the point is, at least at that stage in the story. You know, now as you get farther along in the books and you start recognizing some of these recurring themes, and Kay explores them with more depth as he goes along, then you start recognizing, oh, that echoes or is a callback to what was happening in the, you know, first half of the first book when he was journeying to Sarantium. But that's not always apparent when you're just reading it for the first time. So I say that as just, you know, as an FYI for those of you who have not yet read it and might feel like, you know, that first half of the first book doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. And I'm overstating it. It's not that bad at all. It's in fact quite well written. It's just, you might be expecting something a little bit different as you're reading that first half. Stick with it. Once Crispin reaches Sarantium, a lot of things start happening that only just continue to cascade and multiply in the second book.
Yeah. I agree with that. There's a lot that echoes back to the beginning. Kay is so good at doing that. That's something I really appreciate about his structure too, even though, like I said, his structure never feels to me quite conventional or typical, but at the same time, he does thread things together so beautifully. And he makes it so that I think upon reread, you could see how all these things are layered and foreshadowed from the very beginning.
I remember when I saw Kay describe like specifically saying to Sarantium as the journey from like walled city to walled city. And I think it really made me, for some reason, framing it that way and really being about someone who's not comfortable out in the wilderness, who's lived all his life in a walled city, trying to get to another one, being exposed to this whole like way of the world that he's not used to and uncomfortable with and challenges him. Really made me appreciate, because when I first read it, I thought of it as one big book. And I think now in hindsight, like I read Sailing to Sarantium on audio before this because I got invited to this and I was like, oh crap, I don't have time to read it physically. I got to chapter 3 of Lord of Emperors. Whatever. I remember Lord of Emperors pretty well. But I've really started to appreciate Sailing to Sarantium more as its own standalone novel, a very unconventional structural standalone novel because it doesn't really have like a climax. It just kind of like does its thing. Yeah, I'm going to appreciate that more as like the stuff in between the two cities and how important it is to what Crispin has to realize and demonstrate about the world.
Yeah. So I want to go ahead and say my general thoughts because I really haven't done that about this
That's
duology.
True. No star rating either.
And I'm going to be a contrarian here. So I apologize for this somewhat. Sorry, not sorry. This duology was my least favorite K that I've read. Yeah. I hear me out. I think it is very good and I enjoyed it. I think that for me, how do I put this? I feel like the total sum of the parts or the whole was greater than each of the individual parts for me. So what I loved about this book was what it did thematically. And I know that sounds like a literary snob thing to say, but it's true. I love what this book did thematically. I love what this duology did tonally. And I did something that I don't usually like to do, which is after I finished the duology, I usually like to try to write down my thoughts. And I did write my thoughts throughout my reading experience because I keep a reading journal. But after I finished the duology, I tried to write my own little individual reviews before watching any other reviews or reading other reviews, just to process my thoughts. Because I did get the sense when I finished the duology that there was a lot to process about it and a lot to appreciate that I wasn't quite fully grasping. Um, and I think I, the way that I cheated about this is I did go ahead and read a review. And in this review, I read the poems, Sailing to Byzantium, which I found out actually from Philip Chase. I found out that Sailing to Sarantium was inspired by Sailing to Byzantium by Yeats because he mentioned it in my TBR video. He said, because I joked about how Jake said in his review that there's no sailing in Sailing to Sarantium. And that's when Philip Chase said, well, there's actually a Yeats poem called Sailing to Byzantium, and that might be where he got the inspiration. And I thought, oh, and of course, he does say in the foreword of the book that he was inspired by Yeats. So I did not, error on my part, I did not read that poem before I read the book, but I read the poem in a review after I finished the duology. And reading the poem after reading the duology just completely enhanced my understanding of the themes and what Kay was doing. I also read the sister poem, which is called Byzantium by Yeats, which is also given in this wonderful review I found. And you can also see a lot of connections, I think, to this duology and what he's doing thematically as well when you read that poem. So I do have both poems, and I did ask Bridger if he would read them aloud. So we will do that. But I will say that some of my enjoyment and keep in mind, this is just my own personal take. And I do think it is a very well-written duology. I would widely recommend it. But some of the things for me personally in a non-spoiler way, one of the reasons that I struggled with it, especially the first book, had nothing to do with the book's fault. It had to do with something I was going through at the time when I read book one. Um, and I'll just go ahead and say that oddly, the first half or first third of the first book was the part I loved. I loved that section. As much as Bridger said people would struggle through it and that it was slow, I loved that first section. And it had this beautiful first, the prologue in book one is highly political. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot going on, a lot that gets brought into the story later on. Even in Lord of Emperors, you can look back at the prologue and realize, oh, that character was a charioteer who later turns out to be somebody else. So you start to follow different trajectories and notice little details that come out even in the later books. So I would say pay special attention to that prologue in book one. It's a very politically charged, like I said. And then we go into the story of this artisan, this mosaicist. And then the tone takes on this very melancholic, unusual tone. There's a lot of spiritual exploration in the beginning of the story. And then it goes into Sarantium, where it takes on a very politically charged plot. And the political intrigue is excellent in this duology. It's fantastic. The political intrigue, the court settings, all of those conversations, all of the manipulation, all of the different motivations at play. Then it goes back to a more melancholic tone towards the end of the book one. And when I got back to that tone, I thought this is kind of what I needed based on something that's going on in my life. And for those of you who don't know, my cat died. And I'll get into spoilers when I talk about the part that I was reading when my cat died. But learning about my cat dying and then reading this book, I think had an impact on how I felt about it. With Lord of Emperors, I loved the first part of Lord of Emperors so much. I was so impressed. I was gushing on and on about it in my own mind. And I liked it towards the end, but it didn't quite hit me emotionally on the level of even Tigana. Even though there were things about Tigana I didn't like, I think emotionally Tigana hit for me harder. So I do have some conflicting feelings about this, and I will go into more detail about that when we go into the spoiler section. But I just want to be transparent now, and I know I'm a total contrarian, unpopular opinion. I will stand alone, fine,
I was laughing at Kyle's
It's still my
reaction.
favorite.
I have a question for you, Joanna.
Yeah.
Did you read a hard copy or on Kindle, read it, or were you listening to an audiobook?
I immersion read it.
I'll defend.
So you both read and listened at the same time.
Mhm.
Okay. Because I've read the hard copy and I listened to it on 2 different occasions. And I had a different kind of response to them depending on which one. I had a stronger emotional response to just reading it, the physical copy. The audiobook, the narrator didn't
I'll
do it for
defend
me.
Bernie Clark. I like
and
Clark.
he's competent. I'm not suggesting he's not a competent narrator, but partly I felt like the age of his narrator voice was too young. Now, he's not a young man, but the voice that he was using for the narrator didn't quite have the gravitas that I thought it would benefit from, that the story needed. And as a result, the emotional impact didn't hit quite the same with his narration as it was when I was giving it my own voice, or as I'm reading it myself. I'm not having those emotions filtered through someone else's voice. And there are other narrators of K works that I think are fantastic. I mean, Simon Vance would be my favorite of all of them, but I don't remember who did Arbonne, but he was also
Ewan Morton. That's one of my
excellent.
favorite narrators.
Also very, very good. Bernard Clark didn't do it. And then there was just the fact that his whole technique for narrating female dialogue
was bad. Yeah.
Because his technique was simply to murmur all
Yes,
the lines.
I hated that.
So-
I actually
so
ended up.
he-
Mhm.
Every male character speaks with confidence. Every single female character, including an empress and a queen. And I mean, they're all in this very hushed, murmury, sotto voce type of voice, almost sultry, but not quite. And it's as if he couldn't come up with a better way to voice a female character. But it made the listening a real problem for me, because the loudness dropped by 8 to 10 decibels when he does that. And I couldn't hear what he was saying. I couldn't hear the dialogue. So I'd have to stop, back up, turn up the volume, listen to it. Now, some of that's probably a function of I'm getting old, so my hearing isn't quite what it used to be. But also, if there's any kind of background noise going on where you're listening, it's going to really make it difficult to concentrate on those female voices when they just drop so dramatically. And it didn't have to be that way. So I highly recommend reading hard copy rather than listening to the audiobook.
Yeah, well, so I did both. Like I said, I did not
Yeah.
just listen. I listened while reading visually. And I agree with you. There were times when I actually turned off the audiobook when there was dialogue with the female character and just read those parts visually, because I did not like that either. He did take that sotto voce approach, like you mentioned. But that's another issue that I had. And I don't know that I can entirely blame the audio for this, but I did have issues with some of the female characters. And as much as you all talk about these side characters being so incredible, I'm like, the female characters, I really struggled with. I'm going to say it. I felt like a lot of wish fulfillment with this character. I felt like so I'm going to get into spoilers if I talk about that. So I'm going to pause and I
Well,
will
let's say
get
that. I know exactly where you're going, and I probably am going to agree with you on this point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, just so and I do wonder about that because I am a female reader. So I feel like, yeah, I mean, I will be honest, I do look heavily at female characters when I'm reading fantasy. And that
Someone
is
get Sarah in here. Where someone call Sarah and be like, "We need your support."
yeah, sure. She can come in and bite me. I don't care. I know she loved it. So I know maybe I'm just the odd one out when it comes to this duology, but yeah, there were just certain things, and there were things I loved too. So I'm not trying to diminish everything, but I'm saying that I still have high praise for it, but in comparison to the other K books I've read, this one just didn't quite do for me what those ones did.
Did the structure, because it has kind of an unusual structure in that, and
does.
I tend to think of it as one long novel, although I can see Jake's point of, you can also think of them as two separate ones, but I generally view them as one continuous story. And the climax, I mean, the main big, series of events that happen relatively far from the end of Lord of Emperors. I mean, it's maybe halfway through Lord of Emperors. I don't remember exactly where it was, but there's still quite a bit to, there's quite a bit to go after this really pivotal day in Lord of Emperors. A lot happens on that day, and it's tremendous. But then you've got a whole half a novel that's the resolution of all of these different, many plot threads that that Kay has been, spinning all throughout the story, and then he has to tie them all back together, and it takes a long time to do that. I think he does it well, but it is a little prolonged in some ways. In some respects, I mean, maybe I'd compare it to The Return of the King and The Lord of the Rings. That how many different endings does this novel have? It has quite a few endings, and he does a masterful job of tying all those threads together. But a lot of the big emotional payoff, or you get this really big adrenaline rush halfway through the second novel, and then there's all this other emotional, I'm struggling for the word that I'm looking for, but it's almost tiring having so many emotional components spread out over that long denouement of the story. Again, I think he does it masterfully, but I'm not sure it would resonate with everyone because of its somewhat unusual structure.
I'll
is that something?
Both Return of the King and Lord of Emperors have the correct amount of endings.
It is a long denouement. It is a long denouement. I completely agree with that. And that's what I was meaning when I said that I feel like his structures in his fantasy books don't follow the typical exact structure that you normally see in like a Sanderson book, let's just say, to give the extreme example of like genre fiction. So I feel like he does take some risks and does some different things with it. But I think what he did in that section was important. I think it brought home or brought together some of the themes and threaded things. I think he took the time he needed to. And I actually appreciate that risk, but I can understand how that might it does take time. It does take some time. It does slow down where you might want it to speed up a little bit.
Also, I think like the I can't say that without spoilers. Push that back.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let's go into the poems though, if that's okay.
Yeah, I still haven't read these, so
so
if these made you appreciate them more, imagine what they're going to make me think. No,
I think you will love these poems, Jacob. I oh my gosh, I love these poems so much. And Josh, have you read the poems? I'd be curious.
Not, no.
I think you're going to love them. The question is, which one should we start with? Bridger, do you recommend Byzantium or Sailing to Byzantium first?
I would start with Sailing to Byzantium.
Okay.
That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to apologize to everyone watching or listening because reading poetry is not necessarily my forte. And reading poetry that, in my opinion, is not properly punctuated with enough commas is a bit of a struggle for me. So if I mangle the meter here, it's all my fault.
I can tell you at least I won't notice.
I won't either, but I love your voice, and so it'll be a treat for all of us to hear it.
Yeah. Now, I have read this before, but the last time I read this was, well, except for last night when Joanna sent me a link to it and said, "Hey, what do you think about this? Would you like to read it?" And I read it and went, "Oh yeah, I remember reading this. I read it 40 years ago." It's been a long, long time since I've read this. So let me
Sure.
my throat.
So we'll go ahead and have him read this, and then maybe we could do them back to back. Like, I don't know, or should we? Maybe we'll just do one poem at a time. We'll talk it through what we see as the themes, and maybe from here go through At this point, maybe go through spoilers after this poem. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to the screen. And actually, maybe before I do that, I'll take away the non-spoiler part, and then I'll add the poem. Can we all see that?
Yep.
Give me give me my cue when you're ready for me to go. I've moved to a different webpage where
Oh, sure.
the text is larger, so I can actually read it.
We're ready.
So I'm not looking at you at all. I can't see you. So you're ready for me?
We are ready.
Okay. So this is Sailing to Byzantium by William Butler Yeats. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnet. Let me restart there. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, pern in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. To keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing, to lords and ladies of Byzantium, of what is past, or passing, or to come.
I'm so emotional. I think this poem makes me so emotional.
I don't get poetry. I'm sorry.
You don't get poetry? Is that what you said?
Yeah, sorry. I don't. Maybe one
Blame
day.
my reading.
No, it's trust me. There's no person on earth I think who can make me get poetry except me. So maybe one day I'll be like, poetry will click with me, but I don't get it. I'm sorry.
So Jake, I've always struggled with poetry myself. The thing that I discovered at some point was when I would read it aloud, I would actually understand it a lot better. And earlier this year, I read one of the volumes of the History of Middle Earth that was the entire thing was in verse, like 300 pages. And it took me forever, but I ended up reading most of it aloud, at least enough to kind of get the meter in my head. And that helped me. But I still generally kind of struggle at it, but that was at least something that helped a little bit.
But can't you two?
Yeah, I mean, you can always see the inspiration.
Connections?
I feel like my appreciation is more like just like I'm like, oh, I remember that part in Sarantine. But yeah, like I don't know. Poetry, it just doesn't, like, I'll read it and I'll just be like, yep, those were words. I don't know. I try. I'm sorry.
Well, part of the problem, I think, is they're not complete sentences. You've got all these little sentence fragments and clauses, and oftentimes without a verb. And it's just these descriptions. And then you sort of have to supply the connections between them in many respects. At least that's how I would interpret this particular poem. But again, I'm no poetry scholar.
I do think I guess we're kind of spoilers now, yes?
We are in spoilers now.
I mean, I would say the second stanza kind of talks about, the only theme I talked about on my video was one of legacy, and part of that was the building of the dome and all of this from the emperor's standpoint. And I think you can see some of that in the second stanza there, where he talks about how the aged man is just a paltry thing, and then at the bottom talks about the monuments of its own magnificence. So maybe that's kind of thematically tied in there about how the emperor was kind of trying to build his legacy, because without an heir, he's trying to have some sort of legacy that would live on through this big dome with this big mosaic.
So I agree with you that legacy is an important theme in this story. Another way that I feel a legacy was captured in this duology was when Crispin came upon the sleepless ones at that sanctuary there on the way to Sarantium, and he found that monument of Jad that is basically deteriorating. And that was what came to mind when I read some of this as well. But also, another part that came to my mind when I was reading this poem is when it says here, a tattered coat upon a stick. I love that. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. One thing that came to my mind too, and I don't know for sure what Kay was intending with each thing, but one thing that also came to mind was Zodicus and how Zodicus at the end of book one, he ends up dying. Autumn comes for him and he passes on. He lets himself go. He passes on along with the other bird souls, which of course I think is in this poetry as well, allusions to the birds and the souls and all that. But also there was that idea about his staff.
Yeah.
He leaves behind his staff. All that is left of him is his staff, I think, and maybe a pack he had, and that whoever had the staff after he died ended up having good fortune.
I
So
read
even
that.
though
I
his
listened to that 2 days ago, so I remember that.
yeah, so the legacy part that I'm thinking about, Josh, is how one, Crispin was looking at that Jad statue and he was wondering about the mosaicists of the past that created that statue and how we don't have names for them. We don't know who they were, but they created this magnificent monument of art that is slowly decaying. I loved that particular part of the story and how it ties into Lord of Emperors and his final request to Valerius III, to Leonis.
Exactly.
But also, it's also it also makes me think about that staff because Zodicus, he leaves behind, I guess, a child who never knew him, but that staff was in some ways his legacy. So I guess that's something that I thought. That's one thing of his that's left behind and that provides good fortune for those who pass it down.
I'd
Also-
argue that almost all of the major characters and many of the minor characters are also very much consumed by the idea of legacy, and what are they leaving behind? What have they accomplished in their lifetimes? What proof is there going to be that they even existed on this earth through their actions, their accomplishments, their creations, their whatever it is? And so whether it's as a form of art, because Crispin absolutely is wrestling with this in terms of how much of himself to put into his art so that he can actually live on through his art. But then you have others, whether it's a cook, the chef who is trying to pass on his skills to the assistant cook and develop a new one. It's in the chariot racers who are trying to immortalize themselves through their accomplishments on the track. It's in the politicians, the aristocrats and others who are jockeying for position and hoping to either have an impact on the rulers of the land or to pass on to the next generation their status and position them perhaps so that they might become a ruler or one of the leaders of society. So there are all of these different aspects of legacy in almost every one of the characters, I think. And it's a really neat kind of echo that it ripples in a wave that you can struggling for a metaphor here that actually fits what I'm trying to say, but I hope I'm getting my point across.
Yes. Oh, by the way, Bridger, your audio is cutting in and out just a little bit. Like it seems like your connection might be just a little bit bumpy. Just wanted to let you know. We could understand all that.
I would add to that with Bridger. The one thing that for me, some of the great joys I have in Kay's writing are kind of very small moments that just show you the scope of what you just saw. I don't remember the character's name, but the young chariot racer that won the big race in the second. And then there's just a little nod where they say that oh, and he would go on to be like the best chariot racer ever, and then he'd mentioned his statue would be there for 400 years. And it's just this, I love how he just always gives you a little bit of perspective for this character that we only saw in a few scenes, and I don't even remember his name, even though I just finished the book like 2 weeks ago.
He managed to come second in the
Terrace?
first chariot race as well. Yeah, Terrace.
Yes,
I
yes.
got scouted by Ascordius because he was I
I
read
remember
he has a point of view.
Ascordius, Astorgus. I remember those guys, but
He
yeah,
has a
but
point of view in Sarantium as well. He's the guy in the first chariot race in lane 7 who has to keep Scordius out of the lane, and Crescent's like threatens him. He's like, you better stay ahead of Scordius. And he gets like this great start, and he's all like, yeah, I'm staying ahead of Scordius. And then Scordius deliberately planned it and cuts behind him.
yeah,
It's the same guy. And I think presumably the greens and like Crescents were like, he didn't keep him out. But the blue guy who's like the talent was like, holy crap, like if Scordius had actually gone around the outside, I think he would have kept him out, and he ends up coming second. Anyway, I love that guy.
I want to add a couple of things to what Bridger said as well, because I love that you brought up the art of cooking, of being a chef. I didn't even think about that. So one of the wonderful things from this review that I found, where it had these 2 poems, and maybe I'll link it in the description in case anybody wants to read, is that this reviewer was bringing up how Kay really enjoys bringing artist point of views into his books. So he does so in Tigana with the poets, and he does so obviously in A Song for a Bone with the troubadours. And in this book, we have an artisan, right? We have a mosaicist. So he likes to bring these particular perspectives. And I know that Bridger asked Josh and I some questions about music when we did our Tigana discussion. Something that I find interesting too about the mosaicist concept, in contrast to other art forms, but I didn't think about the chef part, was about specifically the Empress being a dancer, and also Shirin being a dancer as well. So there were 2 dancers in the story, and something that Crispin notes in his perspective at one point is how with the art of dance, it's something that's you can't really capture in a still form. He talked about, I think Shirin's beauty was such as a dancer that it couldn't be caught in a still image. And I loved that he said that, because it made me think about how, when it comes to that theme of legacy again, when we pass things down, it seems to be, to me, like a mosaic piece of artwork is something that could be passed down a little bit more easily than someone who has a dance, who does a dance. I guess you could teach somebody a dance move and continue that tradition downward, but that's kind of something that's like created and disappears in the moment it's performed.
I think there's a lot about like transitory art and in this duology. And there's I think there's like the like flower thing and like that the Empress has that Crispin notes. Yeah. And I think one thing is like mosaics at the time I've learned since I read these were considered like a more permanent form of art, because they just like they last a lot longer than like a painting, and that's why they're like used as decorations. And I think there's still a continued focus about how even the more permanent forms of art are not permanent. Like Josh mentioned that the statues go up, and in the exact sentence where it's like the statue of this chariot racer goes up, one sentence later, like they go up like until the city fell and they were torn down. And it's like, you don't get to actually, there are only degrees of how intransitory they are. There's not like an element of permanence. And I think almost like the amount of characters in this duology who kind of think of what they do as their form of artistic expression, just like searching for excellence as it for its own merit. I think it's really like, it's a consistent reoccurring theme in the 2 novels. Like, I think if you ask Scordius whether like chariot racing is a form of art to him, I think he probably thinks it is.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, I completely agree with you, Jake. In fact, as I was doing my recent reread, which I did on audio, in preparation for this live stream, I kept thinking that every single character is an artist, or a large percentage of the characters in some way, shape, or form either view their work or their efforts in an artistic, kind of performative way or creation kind of way, or Kay describes them as if they were artists. And so this, obviously there's the mosaicist, that's clearly art. But then, and you have dance and some of the theatrical performance, because Sharon and the Empress were dancers, actresses. They sort of combined different types of art in their performances that they did on stage. Then you had the cook. Cooking is an art form. You had Zodicus with his birds. He was creating something with those birds.
And the physician as well. The physician had a certain type of art with his skill as a physician.
That's exactly right. Then you have the politicians, that how they played the game had a certain style to it. There was a certain degree of art, and absolutely the revenge elements. The Styliana and her siblings getting revenge, that was performative. That was staged, planned as art. And Kay describes it that way, even though this is a revenge plot. It has nothing to do with what we would traditionally think of as art, but it was highly performative in the way that they intended it for it to be executed.
Justinian's
even his description of I'll even go so far. I don't want to get into the details here, but love making as an art form, even though the scenes are not nearly as graphic as you find in some of his other ones, but it is a recurring idea that sort of gets tossed in here and there, that some people treat it more as an art form than others, and are appreciated more perhaps for that. Again, I don't want to go into details there, but I just throw that out as almost every element of this story could be equated with a form of art, or is certainly described by Kay in some of that same kind of language.
I think there are two kind of, in my head, were almost notable exceptions. Two pretty important characters that, off the top of my head, I don't think they would think of themselves as artists. And that's Kaja and Queen Giselle. And I think that's partially because they're the two people who are most concerned about survival. Crispin, the first thing he notices when he meets Kaja is that he can see the deep desire to not die that he doesn't have anymore. And he's kind of he ends up kind of wanting to not die, but that's become secondary. He's more he's pursuing excellence and legacy. And then I think there are really two. Yeah. And I think can you guys think of other exceptions? And do you agree that those are exceptions? I'm curious. I think Kaja is the most obvious exception, but I think Queen Giselle as well. And I think she's the other person who really is most going day by day, worrying about survival. And I think Kaja's arc that I like every time more when I read Settings to Sarantium, of there's an opening line to a chapter of whether she can forget to be free. Because the way we think of her life is, Leontes is a good example as well. The way we think of her life is how we've seen her and the role she's in. And she kind of reminisces that, she's that was 1 year of her life. That's that's a pretty small percentage of her life. And whether she can escape how she can escape that influence. And I think having that experience is one of the reasons she is living more day by day and just trying to survive than a lot of the other characters who
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. And okay. I do agree, I think in general with your statement that those are things that set those two characters apart somewhat from others, but I still think they might fit the broad sort of performative art category. Giselle in particular, I mean, the queen, because she is maintaining multiple facades at different points in time in the story. I mean, the first time she arrives in Sarantium and finds Crispin up on top of the scaffolding in the cathedral, she puts on a show for the people watching down below. It's true. And makes it very clear to him, hey, this is just for show. And a lot of her scheming, even though we never really see a lot of the scheming up close in detail, but we see the after effects. Like, okay, so this is what she was planning all along, and how she kind of manipulated and maneuvered other pieces on the chessboard, figuratively speaking, to accomplish what she wanted. But a lot of that was as a result of a degree of artifice on her part, because that's the political game. Now, I think Kaja is closer to what you were describing, and certainly the first arc of her story fits that very well. But once she gets to Sarantium and realizes that she can become whoever she wants to be, and can marry Carolus, and can create a completely new life, at that point, how much of that, I mean, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure of my opinion on Kaja, but I'm not sure it's quite as clean as you were describing.
Yeah.
Once she gets to Sarantium.
And fair, yeah, I haven't reread that part on the current reread, so I might just not remember it as well. One thing that I think, because I did actually, I have reread that Giselle scene you're talking about. I think this is, I think, a subjective opinion. I don't know if this is subjectively in the book, but to me, a lot of like when Giselle is doing something performative, she's doing that to reach an end goal. A lot of like the way the revenge plot against Justinian was orchestrated, it felt like it wasn't just orchestrated to that just because they wanted to kill Justinian. Like they were trying to create something almost like they wanted to kill him dramatically for the sake of the drama and the artistry of the entire plan. I think if Giselle had a direct way of going about it, I think she would have. And similar for like Justinian, I feel like his plan in like the prologue was almost deliberately artistic. Like he was staying in the apartment right next to where the guy got murdered with the person who he probably knew was going to try and end up becoming the Empress. Like, I don't think Giselle's doing that. I think Giselle's staying at home, having a cup of tea, being like, yep, they're going to die now. Like that's kind of, so they did, to me, they felt like, even though like Giselle, when she was being performative, or like the beginning with Crispin, she's being performative, but she's being performative for practical reasons, not necessarily like, in my opinion. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. You can see what I'm coming from.
I do, but I think Kay is directly, I think, accepting that role of art, because he engages in that debate in a lot of other contexts in the story, particularly in the artwork that Crispin is creating on the dome. Is art an instrument of some goal, or is it an end product unto itself? And it can be both. And in the context of the mosaic, it is a big part of the tension on, sort of the religious dogma aspect of the story of what exactly is the purpose of this artwork on the dome of this giant cathedral? What is it supposed to accomplish or represent? And it, at different times in the story, it is described as both an instrument and as an end product, partly depending on whose perspective you're looking at it from. And
what I love about that is how when the mosaic comes together, a lot of it is Crispin. He's even trying to put his deceased wife into the mosaic, and he's putting the Zubir, and then he's adding the dolphins, I suppose, for Alexana. But then at the end, I got the impression that a lot of what he was doing, he felt it was his own artistic expression, and it was. A lot of it was also partly Valerius's vision, Valerius II, Petrus. He wanted to reconcile all these disparate parts together in the empire, parts that seemed like they were irreconcilable, like the pagan religion with Jad religion, the East and the West, and all of these different areas. The dancer who should not have been an empress, all of these parts he was trying to bring together in this broader vision. And it ultimately failed for him, which was heartbreaking.
I thought he was going to survive. I honestly did. I mean,
it's really funny watching people who know Justinian like lives longer read these novels, because I've had someone be like, yeah, I know Justinian's not going to die, obviously. Then it's like, wait, what? That's illegal.
But what I guess what I'm getting at is I feel like Valerius's art form is almost in some ways coming through Crispin's art. Like,
and I think
there's a
Valerius
connection
almost
between
sees emperoring as his form of art,
Mhm.
and he's creating this this image using the world instead of like glass and tesserae. And Crispin thinks about this as well, that he thinks of people as Crispin thinks about like tesserae. And also, by the way, one of the times I've randomly opened to a page of Lord of Emperors, it was the part where Crispin was in a sanctuary and realizes that Justinian would have recognized the Zubier, and 100% like he was the person who understood what Crispin were doing and went along to anyway. And I just want to say, like, that revelation is so good. Because Crispin kind of thinks he's like sneaking it in there, and like, on the charcoal painting, they're not going to notice how much the Zubier stands out, and they're just going to see it as one animal among many. But he thinks himself, like, on the mosaic, he knows that the way it like catches the light, it will be visual as like the opposite side, as like the contrast to Jod, and creating the symmetry that the people were wondering weren't there. But Petrus knew it was there from the charcoal painting. He realized, like,
when I started reading this, and I put something in the Discord just about like the first time I saw the Emperor, and Kyle had commented that every scene with the Emperor was amazing, and he was right. Such an intelligent character, but the moments like that are the ones that stick out the most. I mean, besides the death sequence, of course, but he just seemed like he was always the smartest guy in the room, and he never really showed it or flaunted it. And I mean, so memorable. But it's interesting you bring up the Zubier and noticing the mosaic, because the scene in the first, just thinking about art and lights and everything, the first chariot race, such a brilliant way that you see that how it was won, but then that you see how Crispin was able to pick up how it won, because he sees the world through an artistic lens. And I just loved that revelation after
I
that.
wondered about that too, when he was talking about when all the heads turned one way and then it was like dark. I'm like, was everybody a brunette? Like, and was everybody pale
Most of them
skinned?
probably were.
I guess so. So I liked that too, though. I thought that was really clever.
Actually, we have to ask, because Joanna, the chariot races, can you thoughts?
I thought that they were, so honestly, I have some mixed feelings about him. I thought at the beginning of the chariot race, I was really gripped. I got really, really excited and pumped up. And that surprised me because I'm not a sports person. Like, I hate watching sports. I hate it. When it came to the big climax and the big shift in the race, I'll be honest, I had a hard time visualizing it. Like, I kind of got stuck, like what was going on. And I guess it was later explained. But yeah, I did have some problems visualizing some of it. And maybe it's because I've never seen the chariot race before. So I was trying really hard to put it together in my head. But I did think of Alan. I was like, this is totally written for Alan here. If he's not bitter about chariot races after breaking his collarbone trying to reenact one. But
that's so interesting, that the visualization part, because I stink at that as a reader, but like I could see these races so clearly.
I got stuck at the end. I was able to visualize the first part of it, but then when it switched and when Scordius took the lead, I was like, wait, I don't understand how that works.
Which chariot race are we talking about?
It didn't make sense.
Have you ever watched Ben-Hur and the chariot race in Ben-Hur? Because if you haven't, you should, because that is probably the best way to get that mental picture of this race, with one caveat, which is that the racetrack in the movie Ben-Hur, and that's the Charlton Heston one from 1958, 59, it's too small. I mean, they obviously, when they made the movie, they couldn't have this enormous track, but in reality, it was a much longer. So, I mean, it's treated more as an oval in the movie, whereas in real life, it was a very elongated track with a fairly tight turn at either end. And so you had these long straightaways where a lot of the action happens. And so this is particularly the case in the second chariot race, where so much happens in that very first straightaway at the start of the race. And if you're mentally thinking, well, in Ben-Hur, there's not enough room for
Yeah.
all of that to happen. You know, in the 10 minutes that Kay uses to describe that one opening stretch of the straightaway, it couldn't possibly happen like that. And it's true, it wouldn't happen like that because the track would have been a much longer track that they would have been racing on. And so, but again, the Ben-Hur visuals are really pretty good visuals because you see that jockeying for position. You see, you know, the infighting that's taking place between the charioteers and their different teams, and how they're trying to control a team of 4 horses, which is not easy to do. That, in my mind, that's the mental picture I have, and it worked for me, and I imagine it might work for others.
I need to watch. So what I need to do, and I even wrote a note, like maybe I need to reread this whole race because I got stuck actually with both of them. I kind of got stuck a little bit because I've never seen this before. And so maybe I need to watch that and then go back and reread it. But yeah, I usually am pretty good about visualizing things, but for whatever reason.
I feel like I watched those chariot races, except I also got a bunch of people's thoughts about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very high action. I'm not the most high action. I don't know. That's not necessarily maybe, I don't know. I'm hit or miss when it comes to action scenes, but yeah, I mean, I think it was certainly exciting. I liked the culture around the chariot races and like the whole hippodrome, that description. So I think that added a lot of richness to Sarantium and the empire there. There are several other things I want to talk about, but is it okay if we go ahead and just read the second poem since I already mentioned
and then
we
I
would?
can disappoint you by not getting it again.
Do you want to be the one to read it aloud, Jake? Do you think that would help you?
It will not.
Okay. Okay.
This one's a little shorter, and I think it will be a little clearer, I think, just in terms of some of the call outs that Kay incorporates. Oops. I scrolled down too far.
All right, I'll add it to the screen. So whenever you are ready.
All right. All right. So this is Byzantium, also by Yeats, and I will start. The unpurged images of day recede. The emperor's drunken soldiery are abed. Night resonance recedes. Nightwalker's song after great cathedral gong. A starlit or a moonlit dome disdains all that man is, all mere complexities, the fury and the mire of human veins. Before me floats an image, man or shade, shade more than man, more image than shade. For Hades' bobbin bound in mummy cloth may unwind the winding path. A mouth that has no moisture and no breath, breathless mouths may summon. I hail the superhuman. I call it death in life and life in death. Miracle, bird or golden handiwork, more miracle than bird or handiwork, planted on the starlit golden bough, can, like the cocks of Hades' crow, or by the moon embittered, scorn aloud. In glory of changeless metal, common bird or petal, and all complexities of mire or blood. At midnight on the emperor's pavement flit, flames that no faggot feeds, nor steel has lit, nor storm disturbs, flames begotten of flame, where blood-begotten spirits come, and all complexities of fury leave, dying into a dance, an agony of trance, an agony of flame that cannot singe a sleeve. Astraddle on the dolphin's mire and blood, spirit after spirit, the smithies break the flood, the golden smithies of the emperor. Marbles of the dancing floor break bitter furies of complexity, those images that yet fresh images beget, that dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea.
Beautiful.
All right. Lots of call outs in that one. a lot of some of the imagery and other things.
What's the historical significance of the dolphins?
That was brought up in the book. Remember, he was to make dolphins for...
No, I mean in our real life, because I know how it was in the book. Alexana wanted that,
and they also said in the book that it was the spirits leaving the world.
So is there a historical precedent in our world, or was that just a fabrication?
I don't know.
I don't
feel
know
like
the answer
Max
to that.
Garfield is probably our man to ask there.
Yes, let us know, Max Garfield, about dolphins. He says dolphins and dancing.
If there's a person in this,
So that,
I
but
mean,
I
I
know
would
that was
likelihood of
mentioned in
knowing
the
is
book
Bridger.
about the dolphins, specifically something along the lines of like when the spirit leaves the world, it's the dolphin like taking those spirits out, which is interesting because I mean there's also talk in this poem about the birds, the handiwork. We know about Zodicus and how he's using alchemy to bring those souls of those women into those bird forms. And they are staying here for some time. But there's a lot there. I feel like there's a lot in this poem, especially let's see what else. Let's see. I love the whole imagery about the starlit or moonlit dome disdains all that man is, all mere complexities, the fury and mire of human veins. I mean, what comes to my mind, I would love to hear what you all think, but what comes to my mind is the beauty of the mosaic, the beauty of the dome and the art that is hanging over these humans who are in these court politics, scheming against one another, plotting revenge, all of this destruction taking place when there's this beauty that's above them. That's one of the things that comes to mind, at least with that first stanza.
I love how Kay took the fourth stanza and plugged it almost directly into Lord of Emperors, even though it has no relevance to the story. But there are these couple of references in Lord of Emperors to these flames that just appear in the street at night from no obvious source. It's almost like will-o'-the-wisps or something like that, that are just bobbing down the street. And here in the poem, that's exactly what that fourth stanza is describing, is what Kay put in there. But again, it's just decoration for the story. It adds a little bit of an otherworldly aspect to it, a little bit of the fantastical, but it's not actually related to the plot in any meaningful way that I'm aware of.
That's wonderful. I didn't even think about that. I immediately thought about the Sarantium fire in the prologue.
Yeah.
It adds vibes, which is very important.
Well, Sarantine fire is basically Greek fire, which is napalm. It's jellied gasoline, essentially. And it's one of the ahistorical aspects of the story, because Greek fire wasn't really invented until the 7th century in real life. I mean, it was something significant that the Byzantine Empire used, and they had these sprayers that, little nozzles that would spray jellied gasoline onto people, and they'd set it aflame, and boy, that was bad. Although it was primarily used in naval warfare to burn ships. But I just throw that out as one of those taking liberties with history, and that's what the Sarantine fire was referring to, and that's what Valerius was ultimately cremated with, was gasoline that was naturally occurring, just sort of bubbling up from the ground, and they managed to refine it in a very crude way to create that.
Yeah. We have a
saying he
comment
was cremated with it is a nice way of saying burnt alive with it. But
well, actually, was he alive? He was stabbed.
Oh,
in
I
the
guess he
back,
got stabbed by Pertinius.
So
Pertinius. We
right,
talk about
so
Pertinius.
he was already dead, but they wanted to make it look
Pertinius?
like he was burned alive.
Because Pertinius is like based on a real historical person who wrote, like, I forget the exact historical text, but he was like, this is actually the secret history of like what was going on with Justinian. I notice him more every time on reread. The amount of scenes where someone's just like, yeah, there's Pertinius. I don't really know what he's thinking about. Like he's just there, and everyone thinks he's kind of unassuming. Just right now, what's going on? I hate Britannius.
Yeah. I was just going to bring up a comment really quickly. Matthew G says that the connections between dolphins, Delphi, and oracles, and here Max Garfield says, "Yeah, I second Matthew. Delphi's if I'm saying that correctly, the Greek for dolphin is a very similar word to Delphi's, meaning womb, and the Delphic oracle of Apollo." So, just wanted to mention that. Sorry. Well, carry on.
Let's get what I think I got to the end of the. Oh yeah, Britannius. What has anyone here read like the? I haven't, but who here have you guys like heard of the? I assume Bridger has, probably, but like the historical real version of Britannius, because Britannius is one of the like based on a real characters.
I have not read him.
Oh,
no,
okay. I haven't either. I know him because I know he's like because there's an actual split on historians based on like how accurate they think it is, because he was like a primary source, and he's like a primary source, and a bunch of the other like historical sources are like, yeah, you know, Justinian was really cool, he modernized like a bunch of the law thing, he built the Hagia Sophia and did all this good stuff, and the person who Britannius based off was like, actually he was doing all this horrible stuff, and like and he was actually like a tyrant and was really bad, and it becomes very relevant for this because it's solely Justinian's legacy. Like if Britannius wasn't true, like 1,000 years later, a bunch of people are like, oh, you know, Justinian actually wasn't that great. And I get extremely angry at him because I know based on the modern day that Britannius in world, assuming it goes kind of similar in the K world, is successful at sullying Petrus's legacy that he cares so much about, even without actually murdering him, which is, I think, also kind of symbolic because Justinian cares about his legacy. And in real life, he kind of almost murdered his legacy to a degree that he actually murdered him in the real thing. So anyway, screw Britannius. I don't know if the guy in real life was like, the historian in real life could have been telling the truth. Like, so I won't say screw the real person. But I think it was really interesting of saying like, okay, if he wasn't telling the truth, imagine like how long of effect this person has had on something that the character cared about. Anyway.
Yeah. I hated that character probably as much as anybody in the book, just because of what he represented and just the power that he had as an historian for future generations to understand the era. And then he's just making up these horrible stories about the emperor and the empress. And I just hate it because it's probably very true. I mean, Jake, I know you didn't love the end of like Durfee's trilogy, but I love that theme.
I love the epilogue.
Yeah,
I think the epilogue is genius.
Yeah.
I just I don't know.
It's just a common theme between the two, and that was for me my favorite part of the trilogy was how that historians do have this power to influence generations, whether they're full of it or not.
Yeah, that's even brought forth in like the first couple of pages of the book when they're talking about the first emperor's death and how they try to contrive the story, elaborate story of how he died. I think being hit, like struck by a tree or something along those lines in a lightning storm. Something that wasn't true at all.
The like third sentence is like, even Pertinius of Ebulus, writing only 20 years after, told the story this way, adding a statue of the emperor toppling before the bronze gates to the imperial precinct and an oak tree split asunder just outside the landward walls. Writers of history often seek the dramatic over the truth. It is a failing of the profession. That's the end of the first paragraph.
There you go. It's right there. And I think that also comes forth later on. I want to say in Lord of Emperors with, I want to say Flodian is the name, the sandal maker. He's talking with people on the street and they're talking about this happened and that happened. And there's just some, I don't know, there are some discrepancies in how things played out. So yeah, I thought that was interesting how he played a role in the story for sure. I want to talk a little bit. Also, I just wanted to go ahead and share, because I'm in the spoiler section now, that when I was reading the scene with the bison and when I was specifically reading the scene with Linen, I think is the name of the bird that Crispin has that he befriends.
I don't know how to pronounce things. But...
what was that? I'm sorry?
I don't know how to pronounce things, but...
me neither.
Yeah.
I know, even if I listen to the audio, I still don't know how to pronounce things. So I'm sorry. But that particular scene was the moment I was loving the book, and I remember my husband, he was leaving to work, and he came in. I was walking on my treadmill reading it, and he came up to me, and I was like, "I'm loving this book. Oh my goodness, it's so good." And then he backed out. He came back in a few minutes later, and I was reading the scene where Lennon was sacrificed, and that was the moment he came in and said, "Our cat has met his end," and that's when he found the body of our cat.
Mm.
And I had it was a really hard day, y'all. I struggled a lot with, the passing of my animal friend, and, so that scene was particularly emotional for me given what I was going through and the moment I was reading it. It was uncanny, and at the same time, I think that was also one of the personal challenges I had with the book is, like I said, I feel like the beginning of the book had that melancholic tone, at least in the first chapters after the prologue. And then we go into court politics. And those particular chapters, I think my heart, my emotions were in a different place. I was in a different headspace than where the story wanted to go. So that's what I mean by saying that some of my challenges with reading book 1 didn't really have to do with the book itself. It just had to do with my headspace because I noticed that when we returned, at least at the end of the book, when we return to the first location, when we go to Zodicus's perspective and Zodicus and Giselle on the ship, and then Zodicus realizing that autumn has come for him in more ways than one, then I started to feel that melancholy, sad, wistful tone again, and I think that's just where my heart needed to be. So that was my, experience I just wanted to share, spoiler-wise.
It's always tough when you're. I talked about this, my story with Memories of Ice. When you're not in the right frame of mind to read something, a great book can be anything but.
Mhm.
So, maybe at some point you can revisit and not have the memories of, the death of your cat and all of that. And that might perhaps change your perspective on that book.
Yeah, it was hard, but I did think, I wanna also say that Kesha, if we're saying her name right, was a very interesting character, and we did bring her up a little bit earlier. I did find her interesting in the sense that she is freed as a slave thanks to Crispin, but she doesn't know how to orient herself as a free person. There were several times when she's trying to understand what it's like to be a free person, and I feel as though her relationship with Carolus was very sudden, and I almost felt like it was the first thing she latched on to because she didn't know how to be free. She wasn't even sure she really loved him, but it was like the easy, safe option because
I
how are
think she
you
was
free in
sure
the
she
world?
didn't love him, but she was just kind of like scrambling for something like to anchor, and
To
she was
anchor
just like,
herself.
he seems fine, and he
Yeah,
really and she's like, and he loves me. That's got to be worth something. I
yeah,
was that was literally the scene I was listening to yesterday at work. That's where I
yeah.
got to in Lord of Emperors.
I found that particularly tragic, honestly, even though it's not the worst end, obviously, that she could have had. It was better than what she was going to face, but it was sad to me. And it was also pointed out. I mean, I think Crispin pointed out that he realized that a free woman didn't have the same opportunities in the world that a free man would. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I thought of all the relationships, that one felt perhaps most realistic. Yeah, still
yeah,
unfortunate in many ways, but probably that was not uncommon
I agree.
at that point in time. I got one of the real frustrations I do have with the story is Crispin's mystifying ability as a chick magnet.
Yes, it drove me
Um,
nuts.
that
I did not
his
like that.
sexual charisma is off the charts, even though he doesn't necessarily act on it. But women and royalty, I mean, these extremely powerful women who, they just seem to be falling all over themselves for him. And it's not entirely clear why. Although, I mean, there are allusions to some things. I mean, I think they do like the fact that he is an independent thinker, that he's a creator of beautiful things, that he treasures beauty in different ways. But it happened a little too often
Yes.
for my believability.
This is kind of funny
Same.
because I a lot of time, like, I think a lot of the time, especially like it's women trying to like manipulate him. But then Sarah had the funniest reaction to this ever, because her response was just like, maybe Crispin's just like, she heard like Kyle was like, yeah, you know, people do complain that just like everyone wants to fuck Crispin, and she's like, maybe Crispin's just really fuckable. You ever consider that? And I thought that was a much funnier reaction to me being like, you know, I think a lot of the time it's like people trying to manipulate him and being like, oh, this is like new force of court. This is how I'm gonna like try and influence him, which I think is true. Like he does consider that at one point. But yeah, I think it's a legitimate criticism.
I felt no chemistry during any of those interactions. Like there was nothing building up to any of those interactions. And
That may be Sheeran.
what? She just throws herself on him the second she sees him.
But I don't know. I felt there was more of a connection with those two than any of the other one. The one that bothered me most was actually
the first one was because Pertinius was annoying her. See, it's all Pertinius. Screw that guy.
No, the only one that bothered me was him with Kasha at the end of the first book.
Yeah,
I didn't like that either.
Because I didn't see them. I don't know. I had been picking up more of almost like a father-daughter vibe, and maybe that was just me misreading. But that's how I was seeing those two. And then when they got together, I didn't like that. And but yeah, I guess he's, I don't know. Rogue said in the chat that he's got Riz.
So here's the thing. Like, I agree with you. I think that scene between Kesha and Crispin was actually beautifully written. Like, if you just look at the way it was written, I thought that the writing was a little more beautiful in that particular sex scene than some of the others. But there was something that didn't feel comfortable about that, because he's responsible for her freedom. And she was at that point trying to orient herself and trying to even figure out if she wanted this. It didn't feel like her consent was fully on. She was fully on board yet. Like,
there was definitely some weird stuff going
there, but she wasn't quite stable enough in that moment to me. And I think that, like I said, like, how are you going to turn down somebody who freed you from slavery? Like, there was just something there that didn't feel right. That felt like there was a little bit of an imbalance.
Yeah.
So I understand what you mean.
And there definitely was a power imbalance. Definitely on. I find that scene a little uncomfortable. It's my least favorite scene in Sailing to Sarantium, and since Lord of Emperors is, you know, I accept no criticism of Lord of Emperors, it's therefore my least favorite scene in the two.
There's room for criticism.
I do, yeah, but I choose to ignore it all. And all the words were the correct word. In Sailing to Sarantium, I definitely notice on the second time, which I still don't love it, but how much, because like they're being irresponsible. Like, that's like Crispin, like, you should know better. Come on. How much they have both like really been like just struggling within themselves to accept that they just saw like the Zubir and what they've just seen, and just looking for like a distraction. But yeah, I don't love that.
I loved everything up until then, though, because I think I mentioned this in the Discord, and that was really funny. I mentioned in the Discord about, I think it was some noble person's wife was interested in Crispin, and Lennon saying, you should leave your door unlocked because she's going to come by in the evening. And he decides not to leave it unlatched. And then she ends up knocking, and he doesn't answer it. And I remember I wrote in the Discord, I said, wow, I loved the restraint on both the author's part and the character's part in this scene. And that was the moment I thought, I love Crispin. Crispin has my heart. This is an amazing character. I'm loving this whole journey with the Zubir, all the agnosticism. I consider it very agnostic, because there's like this question of like, well, I believed in Jad, but now I'm seeing this mysticism play out. And who do I pray to? Who do I believe in? I loved all those questions that were coming up. But then Kesha, and then it suddenly went on from there, where every woman who encountered him wanted to insert her hands in his trousers.
I do think the scene with Kaja, I probably would tend to agree with Jake in terms of how I interpret that scene. That it's in part there is a power imbalance, but at that point in time in history, I mean, if we're using this as an analog for our history, that scene probably isn't all that unrealistic. Now, if we project our own values and our own, cultural expectations, it does become more problematic. But at that point in time, probably far less problematic than it seems to us. But I think, Jake, the point you were making, which is they just went through a very traumatic experience, that near-death experience, just terrifying. Think of how many examples there are in fiction or real life where people are thrust together into that type of a traumatic experience, and then suddenly they go off and have sex to relieve stress. But that's the only time they do it, just because, hey, we went through something together, we bonded, let's whatever. And that's how I kind of felt that scene played out. It was more a response to the stress that they had just gone through rather than an exploitative type of situation.
That happens in Malazan, by the way, sometimes, where the characters will go through something stressful and instant chemistry. And I think that is realistic. So that is a really good point. I was also talking about this with a friend, and he was talking about maybe that's realistic in the sense that, so I really appreciated that Crispin showed restraint with the first offer he had, because he was grieving his wife. He was grieving his wife and daughters. So it's somebody who's going through grief. But a friend of mine pointed out that there's also something to be said, and maybe this is, I don't know how this compares individual to individual or whatever, but maybe with some people, they find a way of moving on and processing grief in addition to everything that he's gone through is to have sex, to move on in that way. I don't know. That could be some people's path. I don't know.
Get back on the horse, as they might say, or as they used to say.
Yes.
I think there's definitely the previous scene with the person knocking on the door, I think is a deliberate contrast to show that he's unsettled. I also think you could have had him be unsettled and search for physical intimacy without having sex. Anyway, it definitely didn't show restraint, but it'd be like that. I do think, I see the reaction. I understand where they're both coming from, because they've both just been deeply unsettled and they're unnerved. They don't know what to think. They're conflicted. The more they think about things now, the less the world makes sense. They just want something to not think about. But I don't know. I feel like it could have used a bit more restraint.
I want to go back to something Joanna said a few minutes ago when she talked about the agnosticism in the story. And I couldn't help but be struck by how there's this tension between religion, the worship of Jad, paganism, where you have Zubir and the bison and all of the mystical aspects of that. And then combining both of those, you have this superstition. Because even the Jadites in Sarantium, I mean, they're getting spells cast and curses and other things, because they're superstitious that their chariot driver is going to lose or somebody's putting a curse on them. So you've got all of this superstitious stuff by nominally religious people in a way that's not consistent with the Jadite religion. At least I don't think it is, based on my reading of the books and other books that involve the Jadite religion. But that conflict between them, and then when you layer on top of that what's taking place just within the Jadite religion, where you have doctrinal debates and differences, and this ties into this whole theme of permanence or impermanence of things, that religion and the dogma is supposed to be permanent. It's an absolute, and yet successive leaders are redefining it as they go along. So how permanent, how absolute is it truly if it can be changed just by imperial edict or by the edict of the patriarch or, you know, whatever? And of course, there are direct analogs to our own world and how religious edicts are interpreted or applied, and changes in views. And I'm not trying to go down that rabbit hole. That could get awkward, but it's a really interesting theme that he builds into the story, that there is this tension that is completely consistent with the tension between legacy and the impermanence of all things. And that tension exists there. I also love how he captures other things that seem almost like a commentary on the modern world, except they probably were pretty accurate back then, because, you know, the greens and the blues really did exist back in Byzantium. I mean, the riot that happened a couple of years before the events in this book really did happen because Justinian was a little heavy-handed in trying to collect taxes and trying to, you know, fund his expansion plans and trying to modernize the empire. And so you have this tribalism that, again, is in every aspect of the story, not in Sarantium, but also in all of the other parts of the first book, where he's traveling, Crispin is traveling from one land to the next, and you have these different loyalties, you have these different, you have to be very careful that you don't you don't go out on the day of, was it the Day of the Dead or the, you know,
Day of the Dead?
Day of the Dead, yeah.
Dead, you know, because, hey, there's certain things that if you're not a part of that tribe, you could end up a human sacrifice. I mean, this is something you really don't want to do. But then you have also the tribalism of the greens and the blues. You've got toxic fandom. And Jake, I know you know this firsthand just from your YouTube channel, that you have this incredible, almost Taylor Swiftian type of toxic fandom on your channel, because you've complained about it many, many, many times, and I can completely empathize with you.
I'm too famous. I don't know how I handle it. You know, I forgot to ask. Do you guys support the glorious blues or the accursed greens? Just unbiased question. Just curious.
Funny.
Blues, Scordius blues.
I kept
I'm with the
blues as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick the blues because of their cook.
There you
go.
They have the best cook. You know, so Scordius doesn't do anything for me personally. I do enjoy his racing.
I really like the part where he's going out at night and people find him and ask who he is, and he says he's Hiladico, son of Jad. I just thought that was funny.
Oh yeah. Goodness.
But yeah, glorious blues. We can't let.
You
Is there any
my
accursed
goodness.
greens in the chat? We'll ban you.
so toxic fandom and hero worship and all of these things that exist now. I mean, social media is just, it's rampant.
The best Carolus
and
is,
this was
I love the Carolus, and actually there's a couple arc of the people in chariot races grow to actually like appreciate chariot racing and not just as their team win. And I love the part where this is the best Bernie Clark performance of the entire thing that I've gotten to. It's in the first chariot race where Scordius like cuts behind people, and Carolus is just like, Scordius, my love, how could you have left us? And Bernie Clark put his whole heart into performing that line, and I appreciate that. And how Carolus is still able to like appreciate Scordius, and then you get like the senator's son later. I forget his name. But he to start out is just like, boo anyone on the other team, yay me, and he kind of grows to appreciate excellence during the second chariot race. And we got to see the someone grow past toxic fandoms, be like, That guy is
Yeah.
pretty damn good, and I gotta appreciate, even though he's a part of the accursed blues, except it's the glorious blues because they're the
Yeah.
best. I unfortunately haven't reached that level of character development and stick with my path as being a toxic fan.
I do love how in Lord of Emperors, how you see that the chariot races are such a big distraction for the general populace as to what's really happening. And Kay has little nods with that where they're talking about people leaving the race, not even knowing that, you know, the next day, oh, we're going to have a new emperor and all of that, because it is such this big distraction, obviously. And I just think about real world. I mean, you think about today, like the average citizen might have a greater knowledge of American football versus any kind of law or civics lesson, anything like that. And
I guarantee if the Vancouver Canucks win the Stanley Cup, I will care more about that than I did whatever was on the news that day.
Yeah,
with a high degree of certainty.
Bread and circuses. You're very happy with the circuses. Is that right?
But only if the Canucks win. And there's the line. One of like my favorite pages, I think, generally is there's the bit about how I can almost quote it for those in the Hippodrome. That I can't quote the entire thing, but a reoccurring thing is that the events of history are actually just the backdrop, which absolutely describes like our lives. But I'd never actually it changed how I look at history, and really considering that all this stuff for most people was just like in the background, and they all had all this other stuff going on. The vastly more compelling dramas of their own lives, as Kay would say. Anyway, I love the chariot race for how it actually that some of the lines that chariots actually changed how I engage with history. And it was a chariot race. I don't even know how that makes sense. Whatever.
No, it's true, because you see that in this book with all of these much smaller characters, at least on a historical sense, how for them they're just worrying about their next meal and all of these things, and who their emperor is has such a small influence on their day-to-day lives that I don't know. He does bring that home really well.
He does. There's actually a conversation I think that Giselle has at one point, or quote that Giselle has at one point to Crispin, about how empires continue, the names continue, but I think it sounds like the empire is bigger than the emperor, and how it will continue. Yes.
That's a great point. In fact, a question I had for you all that I wanted to ask, and we've already covered half of it through the poems, which is, what's the significance of the titles? So Sailing to Sarantium obviously is a call out to Sailing to Byzantium, the poem. But what about Lord of Emperors? What does that mean? And how does Kay convey what that meaning might be? And I would argue that he has multiple meanings, because he uses that phrase, Lord of Emperors, multiple times in the two books in different contexts.
And I get
really
to
interesting.
comment whenever people finish Sailing to Sarantium. I just get to comment on Crown the Lord of Emperors awaits you now, and I just brings me joy to be able to comment that. That's my favorite part of the title.
Well, and it's
Is
on
that
page,
said in Sailing to Sarantium?
it's on page 2.
Yeah.
I found that out today. I didn't have time. I wanted to reread the prologue to Sailing to Sarantium before this talk, and I ran out of time. So I read like the first 10 pages just like a couple hours ago. And it's on page 2 of Sailing to Sarantium. And I didn't remember it either until later.
Goodness, I missed that.
There are at least,
but I mean, that
4 or
significance,
5.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, the significance, I think, is just that the Lord of Emperors is God, whoever's God this might be, at least in that stage of, because that's what the emperor upon their death, as they're uncrowned, that's their passing on. But yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting, Bridger, because I gave a lot of thought into what Sarantine Mosaic means. And, I kind of had 3 different definitions for that, but I never actually thought about each individual book as much.
So I'll throw out a couple of things. So absolutely, is it a reference to God or Jad? Completely. In fact, it's very explicit in a few spots where
I actually think Bridger's about to say things, and if the clerics of Sarantium heard what Bridger's about to say, they wouldn't understand it because they don't speak English. But if they did speak English, they'd probably kill him. But I would like to hear.
Well, that's a good thing that I live 1,500 years or 1,400 years or whatever after them.
And not in the same reality. Yeah,
you're right.
You're
only one
safe from
moon
them.
in this world, so not two.
You're pretty safe from them. I'd like to hear some sacrilegious opinions according to Leontes.
Right. So Kay does very clearly reference Jad as being the Lord of Emperors, in that all emperors die. They must bow before their creator, Jad, in that final part of their lives. And that is a consistent theme that does run through both books. However, Kay also uses that same phrase, Lord of Emperors, in a couple of other contexts.
Nice.
One of them is when he let me think about this. It was when he talks about, oh, that's right, when he talked about heroes. Okay, I was getting a little brain fog here. So he talks about, and this was in the context of the chariot races, that in the moment of the triumph of the green or the blue chariot racer, when the factions in that society are all so focused on that one thing, and when they celebrate their hero for triumphing, in that moment, that hero is the Lord of Emperors. That hero's popularity, that hero's power, again, in the moment, surpasses anything that the emperor has, which was a really interesting use, because he uses that phrase I don't remember which chariot race it is, whether it's the first one or the second one, but in that context, I think it's
it has to be the second one. But
I think it's the second. It's the second one. But he also uses it again. I'm pretty sure it's in Lord of Emperors, the second book, where he talks about how the creative process of art is godlike. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but he uses Lord of Emperors in the context of art, and that there's a parallel between them, which I also found, really interesting, how he takes this theme and then applies it in each of these different contexts.
I miss that. I love it when people do things like that. I can't believe I missed that. And Max Garfield's got some up as well. I'm really excited to notice these when I read again.
He says here in the prologue of Sailing to Sarantium, the obvious is to God and the divine, but also to the Doctor. And I do remember that there was that was mentioned with Zutem's perspective at one point, saving the Bassanid Emperor, Britannius judging them in history, and Crispin their artistic legacy. So there we go. Yes. Interesting. So it does capture a lot of the themes that we were discussing. Really cool.
Bloody Protenius gets to be Lord of Emperors. What a loser.
Nobody's happy about that.
No.
What would we do without Max Garfield in the comments section?
I know. He's just a gem.
He gave me a great playlist before I read it, because I was 100% ignorant as to this time period. Even just seeing the mosaics in Ravenna, which now I totally want to visit, was definitely very helpful for me.
It's kind of awkward
to be able to visualize things a little bit
when
better.
People are like, it's kind of hard to when people are like, oh, like what countries do you want to go? I'm like, I don't want to go to Istanbul. It's like, oh, why do you want to go to Istanbul? And it's like, so there's this book series.
I really did. I really found that moment poignant, though, whenever Petrus takes on being emperor and he wants the mosaic to be brought down, and to Crispin, this is death. I mean, that's even written in the text. He sees this as death. This is very significant to him. It's very tragic to him to have all of these images of mosaics that represent Jod, because it's that idea of worshiping idols, worshiping images of God rather than God itself, and that's also historical, I think, as well. But I love that even though he asks that all these images be taken down, that the mosaics be taken down, he honors Crispin's request, which is to allow that image of Jod at the Sleepless One's temple to decay in its own time, so that
And
those people there who revere that particular image of
like
Jod don't
when I
have
was
to see it.
listening at work to Pardos getting there and restoring it, knowing what was going to happen, like it was emotional, and like
Was.
Yeah.
knowing that in combination with Crispin, this would lead to this surviving for another like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
I also loved how Crispin finished his mosaic,
No.
even though it was going to be torn down, and he was allowed to do that just so he could see it. Just one time, he could see it before it was turned down, just for his own sake and his own art's sake. That hit me really strong too.
And
I mean,
how he wanted
the whole thing with Leontes tearing it down, it was just like, it was kind of crushing, you know, especially as an artist, and seeing it was his best work of his life, and to see that it was going to get torn down, but then seeing him accept it, and then realizing he wanted to finish before they tore it down, and that he was allowed to do that. I loved that moment. That was outstanding for me.
Yeah. I agree. And didn't he go on? He
ended up being just as transitory as the dancers.
And yes, exactly. That's exactly what came to my mind too, Jake.
But equally real.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he even chooses to continue working on it for a moment, right? Like even after he's given that.
Yeah.
I had another question. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to ask you all, what did you think about how he assisted? What is it? I can't remember her name now. Stillane's suicide with the knife. What did you all think of that?
Giselle, was it Giselle that gave him the knife?
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like an extension, but I don't know. I saw it as a mercy, that even though I don't know, it was a conflicted relationship. I mean, he didn't like her, even though they did spend a night together, or at least part of a night before he had to hop out of the window. But I don't know. I saw it as kind of a merciful, even though just it was almost a Giselle wanting her gone.
Yeah. I guess for me, it was one of those things where I was like, well, I'm just going to suspend my disbelief in a sense of thinking, okay, this is fantasy and we're just going to roll with it. And maybe this is realistically mercy in this type of setting. But my modern mind, if I allow my modern mind to spiral and to go there, I'm like, that's just kind of, I don't know. That's assisting somebody with suicide who's in a vulnerable state, who had just gone through this horrific treatment, this horrific torture, but still had potential to live. And I don't know, there's something about it that I found very sad that he did that, but I don't know.
Oh,
fun
you're
to ask
muted,
you.
Bridger.
Oh, sorry, Bridger. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to step away because I need to get a visual aid that I forgot to bring with me. But I was going to say that scene is one of those that I sort of have mixed feelings about. It's one of those denouement scenes that part of me feels was unnecessary. Like, you know, the Stillion's arc, I don't think needed to be closed so completely to make the book work or make the story work. Although I understand why he really wanted to, again, tie down every single loose end. But it did sort of stretch out that ending, maybe longer than it needed to. However, going back to something I said earlier in this chat, Stillion was all about performance. I mean, she was performative in everything she did. And she recognized that. The murder of her father was a performance. The disfigurement of her older brother was performative. I mean, it was designed to send a message. It was communicating to more than just the victim. It was communicating to everyone else who was aware of what happened. That Valerian kept her older brother alive in that very, very disfigured and just miserable condition, because I mean, he'd been burned alive. And the fact that Stylion was essentially being kept in the same sort of condition, obviously mostly intact.
Oh, you're cut out. You cut out a little
Weird
bit.
stuff going on with your audio. It sounds like it might have like switched to a different mic than you normally has, because
Okay, yeah, I switched between mics a moment ago. Hold on. Let's see. All right, can you hear me now?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
switch to a different mic. Yeah, I had to switch. I had an actual wired mic that I was using initially, and then you said, yeah, I had problems with that one. So I switched to this little wireless headset, which I've been using just to listen to. And
How many
then when I
mics
walked
does this guy
away,
have?
it disconnected my headset. And so I've switched to a wired mic now. So anyway, I was going to say that Stylion recognized that the treatment of her older brother by keeping him in that barely alive state was a form of performative art. It was communicating something to not just the victim, the older brother, but to everyone else who was aware that he was still alive and being kept in that condition. And she felt as if Valerian, or not, I'm sorry, Leontes, was doing the same thing with her by blinding her and imprisoning her in that same aisle, that she was suddenly being transformed into a kind of performance artwork. And she did not want to be a party to that. And so this was an act of rebellion against being used as performance art. That's sort of how I interpreted it. At the same time, as I said before, it almost felt unnecessary to have that.
It's interesting because I'm pretty sure that Alexana told Crispin. I mean, it's very possible that that's how Stylian interpreted that. However, Alexana was telling Crispin that it was that Valerius, or Petrus as Valerius, was doing that out of a mercy for him with Stylian's brother, like keeping him alive in the prison house and not killing him, because she was saying it would be a mercy to kill him. He should have killed him, and he was saying no, but he out of mercy couldn't do it. Like he kept him alive. He kept Stylian at his court, gave her a place in his court. That was his way of trying to bring mercy, and I could see that as being Valerius's. I could see that being his motivation, because like we said before, he did want to reconcile all of these disparate parts and bring things together. But I can see how Stylian would see it differently. Just as
my
you were
point.
saying.
Is from her perspective.
From her perspective,
she may have
yes.
seen it very, very differently from how Valerian intended it to be, or Valerius, not Valerian, Valerius. Exactly.
Yeah, Valerius. Yeah.
I just call him Petrus.
Yeah. I also want to. I also thought it was really interesting that at the end, when Alexana realizes that the empire has crumbled, that she needs to escape, that she tells Crispin, you might want to go find Stylian. Stylian might be able to help you out. And I thought that was interesting that she's tipping him off to go find Stylian, when Stylian, before she is unwedded by Leontes, she is wanting this hunt to find the Empress and to essentially kill her, or to bring her to court and torture her or do worse to her. So I just found that interesting, that politicking there, that the person that she knows is trying to kill her, she thinks could help Crispin, and offering Crispin that tip. It was interesting. It was just interesting how that played out.
I like that people have forgot about Giselle. And then Crispin was like, wait a second. I love the politicking. Actually, I always find it hard to describe why like the Stylian epilogue works for me, but like when I read it, I find it very powerful. It might be like Stylian is such a normally not sincere character. Like normally it feels like she's just extraordinarily calculated in every interaction. And I feel like Asking for the Night was almost like the first time she was sincere. Except maybe like there was a sentence that slipped in here when she told Crispin to not get too attached to the mosaic.
Yes.
Which I think came out through guilt. Like I think Leontis, if he read Lord of Emperors, would be like, I don't get it. Why is it sad that the mosaic came down? Like it's glass. Like it's fine. But I think Stillane does like feel a deep guilt about that. And I think just that it being such a sad scenario for this to be the first time when we really see her sincere in such a horrible position compared to like she wasn't able to be sincere when she had like everything that theoretically someone would want. Like when she's been successful. I don't know. I find it hard to like explain why that worked for me, but it did.
Yeah.
One of the things that really resonates in this book.
Your sound's being weird again.
Arr.
I've just gotten a tip. Pertinius sabotaged your microphone.
Oh,
All right.
That
All right.
villain.
So let me try again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
yes.
Okay.
can.
Well, I switched to the other mic now. Now I'm back on the headset. I've got redundancy here, which is good. So what I was going to say is, and I don't remember if it was Jake or Josh, one of you mentioned it early on in our discussion. And one of the things that fascinates me is how all of these people, and sort of in these very powerful positions, who are ostensibly rivals in many ways. Some are more honorable than others. Some are very, very honorable, even though they do some bad things, like Valerius. And then you've got people like Stilion and her family who seem incredibly untrustworthy and dishonorable in many respects. And yet, if you really step back and look at what's motivating all of them, and include Giselle in this, they have very, very common motives. They may have different ways of accomplishing those motives and different near-term objectives in trying to accomplish that bigger picture motive. But one of the things that really strikes me is how this is really kind of a political theory exercise, or trying to put into practice political theory, that what they really want is just to be able to preserve social order. That's what all the gamesmanship is for. That's what all the, the backstabbing and intrigue and double dealing and dishonesty and all this, all the machinations that they're doing it partly for their own benefit and for the benefit of their own offspring and the legacy they leave, but also because they genuinely believe in the empire, or in Giselle's case, Batavia, or Batavia, whatever the name of the country that she's the queen of. They want to preserve that. But one of the things that's constantly at risk of destabilizing that are all of these things like factions between the blues and the greens that can create chaos, and you need to be able to control them. How do you control them? Well, you might be able to bribe them. You might be able to use brute force. You might be able to tax them into submission. You might be able to, there are all kinds of approaches that you can take. But at the end of the day, it's really about maintaining social order. Religion, opiate of the masses. How do you use religion to keep people in line and respecting authority figures and following the instructions of authority figures? And so, and the point that one of you made early on is how there isn't a clear antagonist, like villain, bad guy, evil, that's the big bad. Like they're all, to some degree, they have degrees of badness, but they also all, to some degree, have degrees of goodness, that they're trying to preserve their own country, their own empire, You know, they just feel like they might be the best stewards or protector rather than the person who might be in charge at the moment.
I
gonna
found
say,
it.
to give credit to the Stylians, like, you know, they're a little bit more like underhanded than Petrus. He was dishonorable just first and more successful, and then got in a position where he had the luxury of being honorable.
Right, exactly.
When he's in Stylian's position, he's completely equally dishonorable. He's like, oh, do a little murder? We do a little murder and social manipulation.
I found it kind of heartbreaking. I think it was one of the Emperor's last point of views when he realized it's Stylian, and you see that he was thinking that she would be the Empress after him and Alexandra were gone. And it's typical, like, why didn't you communicate? But I found it so heartbreaking because you could tell, like, the way Kay wrote it, you could just feel, you know, his dismay and his disappointment in what happened, because he saw such potential in this young girl that he took into his court, even though everybody said that, you know, this was going to happen and he should have killed her and all of the family. And it's a typical Kay, like Bridger, you talked about this last time that we talked about. He's so good at just balancing the bitter and the sweet. And that was one of those moments where it was just wrenching for me.
It's tragic. It was tragic to me. It was fascinating to me how the way that Kay did political intrigue in this particular duology, because everything that you would think would be a secret wasn't a secret to anybody, except for maybe some of those things that you just talked about, Josh. Like some of Valerius's ultimate plans were somewhat unknown to most of the characters, except for maybe Aliana and to Crispin. Crispin started to put things together, I think, at least at the end. But up until then, it was hilarious to me, because even the whole entire thing that happens in the prologue of book 1, whenever Petrus puts his uncle on the throne as emperor, I was thinking, oh, wow, you know, this seems like kind of like this secret plot. And then fast forward 12 years later, it's like widely known that there was this plot and this conspiracy that happened where this nephew puts his uncle on the throne. Like everybody knows. And then when Crispin comes to court, everybody figures out right away. I mean, they already know that he's not Martinian. Whenever Giselle comes, it's like, oh, we already figured out your marriage proposal. Like they all figured everything out.
He goes to tell Justinian and he's like, he's really worried about it. And they both figured it out. And they're
I think especially both Aliana and Valerius, Valerius, they were so good at uncovering every single secret.
Except for the one that killed him.
Until they killed him, yes. And
except they didn't know about the bird. That was when
Aliana figured it out right away as soon as Crispin told her. And she put everything together right away. And it was also interesting in book 1 when Benosis, the senator, when they're putting what's his name in, they're punishing the tax collector guy. And
Tilikitis, or
thank you. And she comes up to Benosis and says, so I hear that young guy looks really good without clothes on, or something along those lines. Like she lets on, I know that you're having affairs with young men. Like she's on to everything. Like they're both 2 steps ahead of most people. But then in the end, of course, there was a plot that they didn't see, and there were aspects they didn't see, including the birds. But it was fascinating to me how much they were clued in on. And even the scene when Aliana is, after she has the fake sex scene with Rustem, the physician, and she says, so you're a spy, right? And you have to report, you know, what's going on here, or you're going to die, or your family's going to die. And he's like, oh, what? No, I'm just a physician. Oh, she's like, yeah, I've had spies on you for a while. Like, I just found it fun. I found that part of the political intrigue fun. How 2 steps ahead the emperor and empress were in most cases until the end.
About just the doctor and the empress, because I missed this on first read and I caught it on second read. Did you guys notice that like there was a scene where the doctor was being a doctor and he said like you know, a couple women came for help with like infertility, and he said like one of them wasn't actually, and he was like, you know, it's kind of, you know, controversial. It might be that your husband just can't have kids. You guys catch it? That was Alexandra the first time. Yes. I just somehow missed the first, and the second time I was like,
I didn't catch it till at the end.
Yeah, it was fun noticing.
And then then I
Yeah,
kind of
so
put it
then-
together. How was it? I think Zodicus had told, I'm trying to remember, it told Crispin that somehow the doctor was going to be important for him. And he ended up being important for him because he told Alexandra that she could have kids. And then at the end, when they get together, they know that they they start talking about having a family together. So it was one of those things like Jake, you mentioned Kay's not a plotter, but how?
He's not an outliner. Yeah, he just
Like
writes.
how does he plant those little seeds?
I don't know.
I think he's a
become
plotter.
so important
I
later.
think
No,
he
as in
is.
he doesn't outline at all. Like,
Really?
yeah, he just writes and just
Well,
figures
because
it out.
he does such
Yeah.
amazing echoes in his stories.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, obviously he makes a lot of stuff. Surely he makes a lot of stuff work in hindsight. 'Cause how? But yeah, like they all feel like the amount of relevant details and attention to detail it feels like it has to be planned from the start. But
Yeah.
apparently he says he figures it out as he writes, basically, and he doesn't know what is scene is going to happen next until he writes it, and he's like, I guess that's what happens next. And then
Joanna, the one thing I really liked about when you were talking about the political side, how the emperor and empress were always a step ahead. I love that juxtaposition of the first time that you see Crispin in that arena, how he's so out of his element. And even though he's proven through the first half of this book, he's very smart, he's very clever, he can get in and out of situations, and he realizes like these people are doing this on a whole different level than I have the skill to be able to do.
their level.
I love
Playing
that.
4D
It added
chess.
such a realistic weight to those scenes that you don't always get in these kind of scenes. A lot of times when you have a political scene, it's another one of the really good schemers, but to see it from perspective of someone who's not good at this, even though they're an intelligent character, I really enjoyed that, especially early on in the first few interactions that Crispin had with them.
Yeah. Yeah, Crispin was an interesting character. At the beginning, he's described as being very temperamental, being very angry. And as much as that was that was the description of him, I failed to see it until like maybe the scene where he tries to free Kesha. Um, I didn't feel like he seemed like a very temperamental, angry character to me. And then at certain times, he's also described as like a soft artisan, but then
Like-
apparently he,
I think he gets angry with people when he's doing mosaics, but doesn't necessarily get angry with people as much like
That's true.
in
Maybe
data.
that's
But like
it.
when he's doing mosaics, it's like he's like the Gordon Ramsay of making mosaics.
But-
Where he's
but
like,
even
what are
Zodic-
you? It holds up two things. It's like, what are you? You're an idiot sandwich. That's Crispin.
But even Zodicus brings it up. He says, you have a lot of you have more anger in you now than you did when you were a boy, when I knew you as a boy. So there were descriptions of him having a lot of anger. And then oddly, at the end of book 1 or book 2, maybe because of what you were saying, Josh, like how he comes to this court and realizes these people are playing like 4D chess and I can't think that way. Like, I'm an artist. At that point, I think later on in the story, he describes himself as incidental, as not a key player, as not important, as marginal. And I thought, what are you saying? You are obviously interacting with all of these people for a reason.
But I
he
think
didn't
that
see
also,
himself as an important player.
but I also think that as part of the, to circle all the way back to like 2 hours ago with the theme of legacy. For him, his legacy is he wants it to be his art, although you don't sign, but he does anyway. But I think he sees that he doesn't see himself. He sees himself on the periphery, and he may interact with these people, but when they write down the history, no one's going to remember Crispin as being an important part of these
Like
events.
So
So
political, like
yeah.
machination.
So I think he feels that, but it's interesting. You mentioned just how he was temperamental and angry and all of that. I really felt that when I got to the epilogue. Part of what really hit me emotionally was just thinking back to this huge journey that this character took from the beginning of sailing to Sarantium, who he was, what he experienced, how he's grown as a person, how he's gotten through all the things that he was going through at the beginning of the book. And I felt that very keenly. I mean, I was kind of a emotional mess at the end of Lord of Emperors. So I don't know. I felt it pretty deeply.
I felt in the end of Lord of Emperors how Crispin felt when he walked in the sanctuary. I think if I'd been standing, I would have fallen over. I'm like, Lord of Emperors.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Kay was, because just his writing is just so rich. I mean, when he was describing everything, when he was describing these mosaics, I mean, it was like I was fighting tears the whole time because it was just so beautiful how he brought together the empire and himself in this mosaic, and it was so beautiful.
His
Actually,
passion for the mosaic was beautiful. There's one particular quote that I have here, and I actually kept this quote because there is a reviewer. Do you all know John Morano? He does a lot of self-published, and he writes for Grimdark magazine, an online publication. He's a reviewer there, but he's also a professor of glass. Like he studies glass, and he's a fantasy reader.
His last name is Murano, M-U-R-A-N-O.
Oh,
Maybe it's
Morrow, John Morrow. Yeah.
Is it Morrow?
Morrow,
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
I thought it was
said it wrong.
Murano. That's a kind of glass. That would be fun.
Oh, maybe I said that wrong. I said that wrong. Morrow, John Morrow. But I did reach out to John, and is it John?
Yeah, it's John.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I did reach out to him, and I said, I think you need to read this duology if you haven't. And this is the quote that I read to him, and I love this quote, and I love how Crispin's voice comes through as an artist in this particular passage. It's when he's talking to Valerius about mosaic art, and he says here, directly to Valerius of Sarantium, he spoke one of the tenets of his soul. Mosaic, he said more softly now, is a dream of light, of color. It is the play of light on color. It is a craft. I have sometimes dared call it an art, my lord, built around letting the illumination of candle, lantern, sun, both moons dance across the colors of the glass and gemstones and stones we use to make something that partakes, however slightly, of the qualities of movement that Jad gave his mortal children and the world. In a sanctuary, my lord, it is a craft that aspires to evoke the holiness of the God and his creation.
He actually ruined someone's career saying that, by the way, which
Yes.
But yeah, I love
love
that scene where it's like when you ask someone who's really passionate about something and you're expecting like a straightforward answer, and
I just love how he like softens his voice and he starts to just talk about the color and the light and the play of that, and just such beautiful imagery there. It just made me want to swoon. It was so beautiful.
And in addition to capturing the visual imagery, in your mind's eye, this is what mosaic can be.
Yes.
Kay is also raising some of the more fundamental thematic questions of who exactly is art for? Is art for the sake of the artist or the creator? You know, the person they are creating this, they're doing it for themselves, for their legacy, for whatever vision they have. Or is art for the recipient, the audience, the person who's going to experience that art and give it its own meaning? It's a very personal meaning to themselves based on how they experience it. And that's the exact same that Kay then layers into the religious aspect of the story, because can you separate art from the artist, or separate the artist from the art? Can you separate faith from the faithful? I mean, is faith something that is specific to the individual in a very personal way, or is it something that's more universal, that's defined or mediated, for example, by a church, to define this is what faith is, this is what belief is, this is the relationship you have with Jad, or Jad's son, or as the case may be in the story. And that's recurring tension throughout, that art is an allegory for religion to a large extent in these two books, in the way that Kay kind of frames these tensions and debates and disputes, and how different characters interact with art and religion.
Plus how much reverence he writes about the art as well.
Good point.
That's
exactly.
one thing that I personally connect with him, is because of that, and in the way he wrote the music in Arbonne, and it just seems just an integral part of who he is as a storyteller.
Yeah, I like how I think I guess proud he is of the great creations of humanity. I think you have a lot of people who definitely, it's one of the aspects of humanity that I think he highlights more of, like the creation of beauty that we have, that you definitely get, especially I think in some of the more like series that where the authors would describe them as grimdark, where a lot of like the creations of human are described like ironically, and negatively, and the focus is on like, you know, when they go to the great city, like there are obviously going to be negative things about the great city that you also see in Sarantium, about like, you know, the smell and the crowds and like the violence and like the political machinations. But Kay's also going to be like, wait, hold up, like there also were great achievements here as well that I think a lot of time gets glossed over in like the big capital cities and a lot of fantasy.
Yeah, that's valid.
Well, I wanted to mention something. This is I wanted to mention at the very outset when I talked about my love of these books, except at the time I realized I'd forgotten my show and tell. And so I love Mosaic. I have loved Mosaic for a very long time, probably close to 35 years or so, maybe 40 years. And I love visiting places that have spectacular mosaics, whether it's, you know, the Sacre-Cœur in Paris or the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and these places. So about 30 years ago, I bought dishes. You know, hey, you need dishes. My dishes are mosaic pattern, and I have a couple of different patterns of them, and I love these. So the first is a fruit mosaic pattern. Let's see if I can get so the light's not reflecting on it. And they have a lot of different designs. This one just happens to have pears on it. There are cherries and grapes and apples and other things. And this is a sister pattern to another one, and this is just like a little bread plate that has the mosaic around the outer rim with lots of different fruits and vegetables in mosaic pattern. Wish I could do a close-up, but my camera's a little far away to be able to zoom in. But this one is called Ravina. That's the name of the pattern by Sasaki, and this one is called Fruit Mosaic by Sasaki, the same ones. So this predates my read of Sailing to Sarantium and Lord of Emperors, but when I did read them, one of the reasons I absolutely love them is because I love mosaics. It's one of my favorite, forms of art.
Yeah, because it's
And
like,
for
of
many of
all
the same reasons that Kay describes it, although I never would have put it into those kinds of words, how eloquently he put it. But those things, the way he described it, absolutely resonate.
Yeah, I find it because the art in Sarantium is the art of all the Kay's books that I get the most invested in, even though I knew nothing about mosaics coming into the book. So I don't know how he pulled that off, but he did. So
he did an amazing job.
Have any plates with mosaic have a bison on them by any chance?
There needs to be. Yeah. I do love that Crispin continues to create too after going through that, after going back. Because that's hard.
He still gets a mosaic. He gets to make a mosaic that ends up being a maybe smaller legacy, but a legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And
and he signs
one person in this chat, they could come up again. Who knows? There's a lot of K books.
Yeah. There was another, not really related specifically to this theme, but one quote that I loved in book 1, when he was talking about coming across Kesha, how Kesha intersected on his path, as well as, is it Zorgas? I can't remember the other character's name who he ended up befriending, who joined him on his journey.
Vargas.
Yeah. There was this wonderful quote when he's reflecting on these intersections in life, where he says, "So odd, really, the circles and patterns one's life made or seemed to make. Patterns men try to impose on their lives for the comforting illusion of order." I guess that sounds like something a mosaicist would say, but I also love that existential take on people coming together, intersecting on a certain path, and maybe it seems like there's a certain order to it, but it also kind of happens by chance. But it's something that I feel Kay does in every single one of the books I've read from him so far. Characters coming together, intersecting on a path at a specific time in their lives, coming from completely different backgrounds, yet there's something really special, almost like serendipitous about their intersection. That and he so beautifully captures that. Um, and I thought that's such a K quote. That's such a K quote. But it does sound like something a mosaicist would say as well. The
I
pattern.
did love the last scene with Crispin and Kasia. I teared up when she just said, "Thank you for my life."
Mm.
Like, oh, so good. Just so simple, but so true.
Yeah. I love that. I do. I know I've said this before, but I do especially love that. Yeah, although Kesha was much younger, I do love how Kay brings these characters together in older age and creates these significant bonds in older age because I just don't feel like I see that as much in fantasy as I see like a coming of age journey where you have your found family or your friends formed in youth. I think it's really special to see that in adulthood. Because as we know nowadays, it's a little harder sometimes to make friends as an adult than it is as a kid. So
Yeah,
I
and
do appreciate
you see meaningful character arcs again and again in his books with
that.
older
It's
characters.
so true. Yeah, that's true. That they still
How old
have
is
the whole arc.
Crispin, by the way? I know like he's actually I think he's always I don't actually know his actual age. Like I think he's reasonably young.
I don't think
But
they really give away how old
but
he is
I
exactly.
think he's however old you want him to be.
But well, no, I mean, he had to be old enough to have children.
Yeah, but he could have had those kids pretty young, considering
Yeah,
he lived in.
there's a point in.
Oh, your sound cut out again
Your
at very
sound cut
bad
out
timing.
again.
It was Pertinius.
I thought he was
Can-
in
can
his
you-
30s.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to blame this on StreamYard because I'm doing absolutely nothing with my computer and I have a wired internet connection. So there is nothing wrong here.
It's Pertinius, I'm telling you.
And Jake, I will say that there have been a couple of occasions where your sound has clipped out.
That was Pertinius. He
Okay,
sabotaged my mic.
Yeah. What were we talking about? Thank you for getting me off topic here.
How old is Crispin?
How old is Crispin? That's right. No, there's a point in the first book where he actually says that he's, I think, 15 years older than maybe it's Kasia or another character who's only about maybe 20.
That sounds right.
And so I did the math and said, okay, so he's probably somewhere around 35, 36, something like that. So not a young man, but he's still very much in the prime of his life. He hasn't quite reached, and he's about maybe 10 years younger than Valerius, because I think Valerius is supposed to be somewhere in his maybe early to mid 40s. Again, I don't remember exactly why I know that, but Valerius is supposed to be several years or maybe a couple of decades older than some of the other people around him who are much younger. So Crispin, 35 or thereabouts.
That's what I thought too.
Giselle was 19, and then I wondered about Aliana or Alexana as well, because she had been an actress and obviously I think a prostitute at one point, and then when she became empress, then the prologue takes place 12 years prior to the start of the story. It's interesting to think about that, but she's still able to have children. So I do appreciate, by the way, that Kay makes older women who are not necessarily in their 20s or younger sexually attractive. I think that's kind of nice. But there's something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. Anyway, oh yes, I did have one more question for you all about the plot of this, and that has to do with Giselle. When Giselle goes to see Leontis by himself and has that little bit of an affair with Leontis, what was she plotting ahead? I mean, she was clearly plotting ahead, but I just failed to understand what her mindset was, with that.
My theory is that not that she was planning to marry Leontis. Maybe she was. I mean, it's possible that that's the case, but there definitely isn't a lot of groundwork that Kay lays to make you believe that. I think it was more that she knew that Leontes would be leading the armies that would definitely be invading her country.
Yes,
so
that's
Makes
right.
sense.
hmm
She wants to make sure that he will have something that mitigates maybe the harshness, that how he treats her country, maybe that she will have some grounds to appeal for leniency or sympathy, or maybe just leverage over him, that he doesn't want to disclose to his wife that he had an affair, because his wife is powerful in her own right,
And she
based
would
on
never
her own
have an
family.
affair.
Yeah, and she would never retaliate either against
Yeah.
him. So he might be afraid of her in some respects. So I think it was just a way of her getting a little bit of leverage, maybe soft leverage or maybe hard leverage over Leontes, knowing that he would have a tremendous amount of control over her country at some point in the not too distant future.
That makes
That
sense.
makes perfect sense. I
Absolutely.
absolutely agree with this theory. I think that makes perfect sense. And it's
Thanks, Mike.
sad too. It's sad because she has to use herself in that way. I even noted that at the end of sailing to Sarantium, when she's on the boat with Zodicus, Zodicus notes that she looks at him a certain way and she almost tries to seduce him at a certain point. And he doesn't take that. I mean, he doesn't take the bait with that. But I mean, I
gotta
know
go to
she's
the
doing what
river
she
side.
has to do. It's
Yeah.
kind of like what you were saying earlier, Jake. Like she's very much in survival mode. I mean, for her for her land, for her kingdoms. But my goodness, it puts her in some really tough situations, really precarious situations. Oh, we have Mike in the chat
Yeah.
here. He says,
Thanks,
I've
Mike.
not read GGK, but just wanted to that we're all pretty. Thank you. Very kind of you to say. Yay. You're pretty too, Mike, by the way. She is young, younger than Petrus, so about Crispin's.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot and we're over 2 hours into this chat, which is amazing. I guess there's a lot to say, obviously, and I'm sure there's even more we didn't cover, but any final thoughts or anything else you all wanted to cover before we close this wonderful discussion? I really appreciate your time.
Lord of Emperors is awesome.
I love this author.
Did you have to read both books though? You can't just start with Lord of Emperors. Because you're not gonna understand
Yes,
what's
yes.
going on.
Don't that
So-
that would be that's there's not that many GGK books you can't start with. Lord of Emperors is definitely one of them. Yeah, Lord of Emperors, Wandering Fire, Darkest Road. You could probably get away with starting with River of Stars. It'd be kind of a cursed decision, and I'd be like, why though? But if it was the only one you owned, and it was just like it's the only one I got, I'd be like, I mean, I guess you can read it. Or Jezebel would be kind of interesting to start. Anyway, Lord of Emperors is awesome. When I think of Lord of Emperors, I think of the expression for movies that like every frame a painting. That's how I feel about Lord of Emperors, of like each scene is its own work of art that I'm impressed with.
Yeah. Interesting. Great.
I can't wait to read my next GGK, and it's going to be like Monday.
What is it? What are you going to read next?
Yeah, I'm going to go to Last Light of the Sun next.
That's kind of, you have more of the people who would be like Kaja, who have more people worried about survival. He said like while writing, he likes to write in these like empires that are kind of decadent and opulent. And Last Light of the Sun is more like Saxon, and it's more like, the people worried about like not dying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would love to hear from you all, by the way, what GGK I should read next. But
see, you've read Arbonne, Aurasant,
Under Heaven.
Ghana, and Sarantine.
Under Heaven. Under Heaven.
Can't go wrong with that. You've got a lot of depends. Do you want to just read like the next one that we think is the best, or I mean, like there's so many valid options. If there's like a setting that sounds interesting, there's a few you could go to. Yeah. Under Heaven's really, really good though.
Well, Josh gifted me Under Heaven for my birthday, so I'll.
Have you read A Brightness Long Ago?
I haven't, and I own that.
Okay, those would be that I would say either one, great. But if you go Brightness Long Ago, then you do need to follow it up with the other two in that sequence, which are part of this larger world that we've been talking about with the Sarantine Mosaic.
They're like the most connected. I almost
Right.
think of Brightness, Children of Earth and Sky, and All the Seas of the World as like a pseudo trilogy.
Right.
They're not like the main plot of each is different from the main plot of the other two, but a lot of the secondary plots are also secondary plots in the other ones. So there's like through lines.
Sarantium,
Only
hundreds of years in the future. And so it might be a nice companion to go directly into Brightness Long Ago, which is
that's my second favorite.
Best. Yeah, it's fantastic. My final words here, as I reread of Sarantine on audios, I still.
Oh, you cut out. Oh.
We're missing your final monologue. Pertinia strikes again.
I wonder if it's something to do with the hand waving, because I've noticed that when your hand is waving, the sound seems to be glitching a little bit more.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can. Pertinius can.
Yes. You can.
Persistent.
Okay. All right. So anyway, as I was saying, since I did my recent reread on audio this time, my experience reading it wasn't quite as positive as it was the first time, earlier times when I read it in an actual book, the physical copy. And in my earlier tier ranking, this was right up there at the tippy top, except not number one, it was number 2 on my ranking list. I don't think I would put it number 2 anymore. It's still in my top tier. It's still one of my absolute favorites. But the more time has gone on since I did that tier ranking 2.5 years ago, I think I would do my tier ranking a little differently now, just as I've thought more about the books and my experience with them. And the emotional impact, and I still need to do a more recent reread of Lions, because that one I'm going on like 15 or 20 years of memory on that one. So that one's still number 1, but number 1 with an asterisk. I could downgrade it a little bit, but of all of the recent in the last few years that I've read, which is all of them now, except for Lions, Under Heaven is the one that I think had the greatest emotional impact, the incredible depth of storytelling. It doesn't have the complexity that Sarantine Mosaic has. I think this is Kay's, in some respects, most ambitious work, trying to weave together so many different pieces and plot lines and characters. And I mean, the metaphor of this is a mosaic of a book is a very apt one in that respect. But the one that now I think really resonates the most with me is Under Heaven, and I highly recommend it. I also, the more I thought about A Brightness Long Ago, the more I enjoy it. Although in my earlier tier ranking, my only real criticism of it was just too short.
It's the shortest.
I love that book. Yeah,
it might honestly be the most impressive one. Lord of Emperors is my favorite, but it gets to pay off stuff in Sailing to Sarantium. Brightness Long Ago has to start almost from scratch,
right? And
it's like 300 and something pages, and it's unbelievable.
I agree. I love A Brightness Long Ago, and I probably would put it in my top tier now, because I think I put it in the only outstanding tier at that time. But my reason for doing so was not necessarily the most well thought out. So I've given it more thought. So those are the two that I would say prioritize. Josh, same for you if you haven't read either one of those. Although, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going with Last Light of the Sun.
No, I haven't read Brightness, but I've read Under Heaven and River of Stars. Okay. Yeah, I love Under Heaven. That's S tier for sure.
All right. Well, I'm taking all that into consideration. Anybody else have any final thoughts before we close?
Uncrown, the Lord of Emperors awaits you now.
Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone in the chat. Max Garfield, you are a gem with all of your knowledge.
Is the Lord of Emperors.
Yes, and thank you again to my lovely guests here. Um, I'll highlight his comment really quickly. He said, "I have said it before, but under heaven should be taught next to War and Peace." Well, that's very high praise. I still need to read War and Peace, but I do want to read that at some point too. But anyway, thank you all so much, especially if you've stuck it out with us this long, this far. Um, Appreciate you all so much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.